Let me ask you something simple. Stand up. Or if you are lying down, just imagine standing up at the end of a long day on a hard kitchen floor. Your shoes are off. Your feet are flat on the tile. You are not moving. You are just standing there, tired, waiting for the kettle or staring at nothing in particular. Now look down at your feet. Feel them. They feel heavy, don't they? Maybe the ankles look a little thick. Maybe there is a faint ache, a fullness, a sense that the legs down there belong to somebody older than the rest of you. Here is my innocent little question. Why? Why should standing still, doing nothing, cost you anything at all? You are not lifting a weight. You are not running. You are just standing. And yet something is happening in those legs, something is building up, some price is being paid. What is it? Most people, if you ask them, will shrug and say, well, I'm tired, I've been on my feet all day. And that is true, but it is not an answer. It is a feeling dressed up as an explanation. Because tiredness is a word, and I want to know the thing underneath the word. I want to know what is actually going on down there in the meat and the tubes and the fluid of your leg while you stand there thinking you are doing nothing. And the answer, the real answer, is that you are not doing nothing. You are holding up a column of liquid, a tall one, and that column is pressing down on the bottom of you with a force you never asked for and never notice, because it has been there your whole life, quietly every second you have ever stood upright. Let me put a number on it, because a number is where the fun starts. Standing perfectly still, an average grown person has a pressure at the ankle of about 90 millimeters of mercury. Now, millimeters of mercury is just the way the medical people like to measure pressure, and we will make friends with that unit as we go. For now, hold on to the idea that 90 of those units is a real substantial pressure. It is roughly the same pressure that sits at the bottom of your arteries when your heart squeezes. That much. Sitting on your ankle. Just from standing, and nobody put it there on purpose. No pump generated it, no disease caused it. It is pure gravity, pure fluid sitting in a tube doing exactly what fluid in a tube must do. And I find that marvelous, because it means the ache in your feet at the end of the day is not really a medical fact first. It is a physics fact first. It is the same physics that governs a glass of water on the table and a water tower over a town and the hull of a submarine, and the garden hose coiled up in the yard. The exact same physics. Your leg is a plumbing problem, and once you see it as a plumbing problem, you can start to see why some people's legs stay young for 40 years and other people's legs turn old and heavy and swollen, and, better than that, you can start to see what to do about it. Because there is something to do about it, and it is almost stupidly simple, and by the time we are done tonight, you will understand exactly why it works. All the way down. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let us go slowly. We have all night. Let us start with the water in the glass. Because if you understand the water in the glass, you understand your ankle, and once you understand your ankle, we can start climbing up into the really beautiful machinery your body built to fight back. Picture a tall glass of water on the table in front of you. The water at the very top, at the surface, is under almost no pressure, just the weight of the air above it, which we can ignore for now. But go to the bottom of the glass. The water down there is holding up all the water above it. Every little bit of water at the bottom has the whole column pressing down on it. So the pressure at the bottom is higher than the pressure at the top. And it is not a mysterious amount. It follows a rule so clean and so simple that you can carry it around in your head for the rest of your life. The pressure at the bottom equals the density of the liquid times the strength of gravity times the height of the column. That is the whole thing. Density times gravity times height. Three things multiplied together, and out comes the pressure. Physicists write it in a shorthand. Pressure equals rho GH, where rho is that funny Greek letter we use for density, G is gravity, and he is the height. But you do not need the shorthand, you just need the idea. Taller column, more pressure. Denser liquid, more pressure. Stronger gravity, more pressure. That is it. There is nothing hidden. Now watch what this simple rule tells you. It says the pressure at the bottom does not care how wide the glass is. A thin glass and a fat barrel filled to the same height have the same pressure at the bottom. That surprises people. They think a fat barrel of water should press down harder because there is more water. But no, the extra water in the fat barrel is also sitting on more floor, so it spreads out, and the pressure, the force per little patch of area, comes out exactly the same. Only the height matters. Remember that. Only the height. Because your body is going to spend enormous effort, as we will see, doing one clever trick. And the trick is to cheat the height. So now take this rule and stand it up inside your leg. Your blood is a liquid. It sits in tubes. And when you stand upright, the tallest, most important column of it runs from your foot all the way up to your heart. Not just to your knee, not just to your hip, all the way up to the right side of your heart, to the little chamber called the right atrium where the used blood comes home. That column in an average person is about 130 centimeters tall. A little over 4 feet of liquid standing on end inside you, and blood is a touch heavier than water. About 6% denser because it is water with a great crowd of cells and proteins and salts dissolved and suspended in it. Its density is around 1,060 kilograms for every cubic meter, where plain water is 1,000. So it presses down a little harder than water would. Now do the multiplication that nature does automatically. Take that density, 1,060. Multiply by gravity. Multiplied by that height, 130 centimeters. Turn the crank on the arithmetic, convert into the units the doctors use, and out comes a number. And the number that falls out of that little calculation is right around 90 millimeters of mercury. The very same 90 I told you was sitting on your ankle. It is not a coincidence, and it is not biology being strange. It is rho GH. It is the glass of water. It is the oldest, plainest physics there is, and it is happening inside your foot every moment you stand. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is the foundation of everything else tonight. The heaviness in your feet is a column of liquid obeying a rule you could teach to a clever child in 5 minutes. When you lie down, the column tips over. It is no longer 130 centimeters tall from the ankle up. It is nearly flat. The height h collapses towards zero. And so, by the same rule, the pressure at your ankle collapses too. That is part of why it feels so good to put your feet up. You are not resting a muscle, you are shortening a column. You are cheating the height. The physics changes the instant your geometry changes. But here is the trouble, and here is where the real story begins. You cannot spend your life lying down. You have to stand. You have to walk. You have to live upright, which is the posture our whole strange upright species chose a very long time ago. And upright means that tall column is there, loaded every single time you are on your feet and holding still. 90 millimeters of mercury pressing down, pressing out, pushing against the walls of your veins hour after hour. And veins, I have to tell you, are not built like sturdy pipes. They are thin. They are floppy. They are soft-walled tubes that can stretch and bulge when the pressure inside them climbs. So you have a soft tube, and inside it a tall column of liquid pushing outward with real force, all day long. If that were the whole story, every human being would have ruined, swollen, aching legs by the age of 20, and we would all be miserable, and nobody could hunt or farm or dance or walk to the well. Standing still would slowly wreck us. But we are not wrecked. Most of us, most of the time, walk around on perfectly good legs for decades. So something must be fighting the column. Something must be reaching in and cutting that tall, dangerous 90-unit column down to size. Something clever. Something you carry with you and use thousands of times a day without ever once deciding to. And when it works well, your legs feel young. And when it starts to fail, slowly, quietly, over years, your legs begin to feel old before the rest of you does. So that is our mystery for tonight, and it is a good one. What is fighting the column? How does the body take a tall, loaded, heavy tube of liquid and turn it, in a matter of seconds, into something light and safe? Let us go find out, one layer at a time, And let us start with a trick that a good plumber would recognize instantly. A good plumber, faced with a tall vertical pipe full of water, does not stand there and curse gravity. He reaches into his bag and pulls out a small brass fitting, and he threads it into the line, and the problem is solved. That fitting is a check valve. It is one of the oldest and cleverest ideas in all of engineering, and the wonderful thing, the thing I want you to sit with tonight, is that nature thought of it first, long before there were any plumbers. And the version nature built is better than anything you can buy at a hardware store. Let me tell you what a check valve does, because once you feel it in your bones, the whole story of your legs opens up. Imagine a pipe standing straight up, and inside it, water wants to flow one way, upward, but it must never ever be allowed to slip back down. A check valve is a little door inside the pipe. When the fluid pushes upward, the door swings open and lets it pass. Easy. No argument. But the instant the fluid tries to fall back down, the door slams shut. It is a one-way street built into the plumbing. Flow up? Yes. Flow down? Never. Now picture what that little door does to a tall column of water. Without the valve, you have one unbroken tube from top to bottom, and the pressure at the bottom is the full weight of the whole column, exactly the 90 units we found waiting in a still leg. But put a check valve halfway up, and something marvelous happens. The moment nothing is pushing upward, that door shuts. And now the bottom half of the pipe no longer feels the top half at all. The door is holding the top half up, taking its weight on its own little hinges. You have cut one tall column into two short ones. The bottom segment only carries its own modest height. The pressure at the very bottom drops because the crushing weight of everything above the valve is no longer resting on it. It has been caught and held part way up. Put in a second valve, and a third, and a dozen, spaced up the pipe like rungs on a ladder, and you have performed a small miracle. That single dangerous 90-unit column has become a stack of short, gentle, low-pressure segments, each one holding up only the little bit of liquid between itself and the valve above it. The tall load has been sliced into thin, harmless slices. Nobody at the bottom is being crushed anymore. That, in one picture, is what keeps your legs alive. And this is precisely, almost eerily precisely, what is built into your veins. Line the inside of a vein and you find, spaced along its length, tiny structures called valves. They are not brass. They are soft, translucent flaps of tissue, thin as the skin of an onion, and yet, for their job, they are astonishingly strong. Each valve is made of two leaflets, two little cusps, facing each other like a pair of cupped hands, or like the double doors of a saloon that only ever swing one way. The anatomists call this a bicuspid valve, which only means two leaflet. Nothing more mysterious than that. And here is a piece of engineering so pretty it makes me smile every time. Right where each valve sits, the wall of the vein bulges out a little. It swells into a small rounded pocket, a localized widening, a sinus. Why would the plumbing bulge out exactly where the door is? Think about the leaflets swinging open. If the wall was straight and tight, the open leaflets would press flat against the sides and get in the way of the flow, and worse, they would have no room to swing back shut in a hurry. But because the wall bulges into that little pocket, the open leaflets tuck neatly into the recess, out of the stream, and there is a small reservoir of blood sitting behind them, ready to slip in and float them closed the moment the flow reverses. The bulge is a landing pocket for the doors. Nobody drew that on a blueprint. It grew that way, because the ones that grew that way worked better. Now watch these valves in action, because the timing is the whole secret. When the muscles of your leg squeeze, blood is driven upward, and every valve in its path swings open to let it rush through. Then the muscles relax. For one instant, gravity grabs the blood and tries to haul it straight back down toward your foot. And that backward tug is exactly what the valves are waiting for. The reversing blood slips into those little pockets, floats the two leaflets up toward each other, and they meet in the middle and seal. The door is shut. The blood that just got lifted is caught up there, held on the far side of the valve, and it cannot fall back down. It has been ratcheted upward, one notch, and the ratchet will not let it slip. The whole closing takes something like half a second to a second after the muscle lets go. That is all. A blink, and then another blink, and the door is sealed. And notice what has happened to our tall column. In the still leg, we had one unbroken tube from ankle to heart, 90 units at the bottom. But in a leg whose valves are healthy and working, that tube is chopped into a whole series of short segments, valve above valve above valve, each one carrying only the small weight of the blood between itself and the next door up. The tall, dangerous column has been sliced into a stack of gentle little ones. The plumber's trick, performed thousands of times a day in the dark inside you without a single conscious command from the boss upstairs. Feel how elegant that is. You do not have valves in order to move blood upward. Moving it upward is a different job, and we will meet the engine that does it soon enough. The valves have a humbler and just as vital task. They hold the ground you have already gained. They are the pulls on the ratchet. The muscle lifts the blood, and the valves refuse to let it fall. Lift and hold. Lift and hold. Between the two of them, the column never gets a chance to reassemble itself into that full crushing height. Your legs stay light because the tall tube is never allowed to exist for more than a second at a time. Now I have to tell you the other half, the sadder half, because a story about a clever machine is not honest unless you also say what happens when the machine wears out. And these valves do wear. They are soft tissue, and they live in a hard place, taking the shove of the blood and the pull of gravity over and over, every step, every day, for all the years you are alive. Slowly, quietly, the wall of the vein itself begins to change, and it changes in a way that dooms the valves. A vein wall is not a simple rubber hose. It is built in 3 layers, 3 concentric rings wrapped one inside the next, and each ring has a job. The innermost layer, the lining that the blood actually touches, is smooth and slick, laced with fine elastic fibers. The middle layer is the muscular one, a ring of smooth muscle woven through with elastic tissue, the layer that gives the vein its tone, its ability to tighten and relax. And the outermost layer is the tough coat, the sheath that holds the whole thing together and anchors it to the flesh around it. 3 rings, inner, middle, outer, each doing its part. With age, all 3 of them go wrong, each on its own schedule, and it is a quiet conspiracy. The inner lining thickens, and the fine elastic fibers in it lose their neat arrangement and fall into disorder, so the smooth, slick surface grows uneven and stiff. The middle muscular layer thickens too, but not in a healthy way. The muscle overgrows, and the elastic fibers woven through it turn faulty, dystrophic, misshapen, so the layer that once tightened and sprang back now sits there overgrown and slack. And the outer coat stiffens and hardens, losing the supple give it used to have. The whole tube grows thick and rigid and wide. And here is the cruel consequence. The place where all 3 failures meet and do their damage. Remember that the 2 leaflets of a valve must reach across the vein and touch in the middle to seal. They are sized to meet across a vein of a certain width. But as the wall degrades and the vein dilates, the tube gets wider. The 2 leaflets are now trying to span a gap that has grown too large for them. They reach for each other and they no longer quite touch. A little channel opens down the center, right between the cusps, and through that channel the blood slips backward. The door no longer shuts all the way. The ratchet has lost its grip. And once that happens, you fall into a trap that feeds on itself, a vicious little loop that is the root of nearly all the trouble to come. A leaky valve lets blood fall back down, so the pressure below it rises. Higher pressure pushes harder on the already weakened wall, and the vein dilates a little more. A wider vein means the leaflets are even farther from meeting, so the leak gets worse, so the pressure climbs higher, so the wall stretches wider still. Round and round it goes, each turn of the wheel making the next turn worse. Higher pressure, wider tube, leakier valve, higher pressure again. It does not announce itself. There is no alarm, no sudden pain. It just turns, slowly, over years, one quiet notch at a time, and the tall column that your valves use to slice into harmless slices begins, segment by segment, to knit itself back into one heavy, loaded, aching whole. That is the beginning of how a leg starts to feel old. But the valves, remember, were only ever the poles that hold the ground. We have not yet met the engine that does the lifting. And to find it, we have to go looking in a muscle that most people cannot even name. So let me take you into the back of the lower leg, into the meat of the calf where the real work happens. Put your hand there for a moment on the soft swell just below the back of the knee and then slide it down toward the ankle. Under your fingers, near the top, is a muscle almost everyone has heard of. That is the gastrocnemius, the one that gives a runner's calf that rounded shape, the one that flexes up like a small hill when you rise onto your toes. It is showy. It is close to the skin. It gets all the attention. But underneath it, buried, quieter, flatter, broader, lies another muscle that hardly anyone can name, and it is this hidden one that I want you to fall a little bit in love with tonight. It is called the soleus. The name comes from an old word for a flatfish. A sole, because that is roughly its shape. A broad, flat slab of muscle pressed against the deep bones of the shin. It does not bulge dramatically. It does not win anybody a photograph. And yet, of all the pumps in your body, this may be the second most important one you own, right after the fist of muscle in your chest. Why do I make such a large claim for such a modest hidden muscle? Because of what is threaded through it. If you could open the soleus gently and look inside, you would not find plain solid meat. You would find the muscle riddled with soft, thin-walled pouches, wide chambers in the veins, swellings and pockets and reservoirs that anatomists call the soleal sinusoids. Think of a stiff sponge with the water squeezed out of it, and then think instead of a sponge sitting fat and heavy, soaked, every hollow filled. That is the soleus at rest. Those thin-walled sinuses are storehouses. They hold blood, and not a trifling amount. At rest, this one muscle can cradle many times the ordinary volume of blood you would expect to find in a simple length of vein. It is a warehouse of blood, sitting there in the back of your leg, patient, loaded, waiting. I find the sheer plumbing of it staggering when you count it. Somebody with more patience than I will ever have sat down and dissected these legs and counted the individual veins running through the soleus muscle one by one, tracing each little channel. And the number they arrived at, across the legs they studied, was 4,679 distinct soleus veins. 4,679. That is not a river. That is a delta. That is an enormous branching network of soft tubing woven right through the muscle, a whole hidden waterworks that most people go their entire lives without knowing they carry with them everywhere they walk. Now here is the trick nature played, and it is a beautiful one, so let me lay it out slowly. Those soft blood-filled sinuses do not sit in some quiet corner where nothing happens to them. They sit inside the muscle. They are embedded in the very tissue that contracts. So what happens when you stand up on your toes, when you push the ball of your foot against the floor, when you take a single step and the heel lifts and the calf tightens? The muscle shortens and hardens. It goes from soft to firm. And in doing so, it clamps down on those thin-walled sinuses buried inside it. It squeezes the sponge. All that stored blood, all the contents of those thousands of little veins gets pressed, and because the valves above are open and the valves below have snapped shut, it has only one way to go. Up. Toward the heart. In one contraction of that flat hidden fish-shaped muscle, a whole reservoir of blood is wrung out and lifted against gravity up the leg on its way home. This is why, for well over a century, people who study the body have given the calf a second name. They call it the peripheral heart. Some call it simply the second heart. And I want you to sit with that phrase, because it is not a poetic flourish. It is close to literal engineering truth. Your chest heart pushes blood down and out through the arteries. That part is easy, the heart is strong, and gravity is helping on the way down. But getting the blood back up the legs against that tall, heavy column we have been talking about all this while, that is the hard direction. And the chest heart is too far away and too weak by the time its push reaches your ankles to do that job alone. So the body grew a helper. It grew a pump down where the problem is, right at the bottom of the column, and it disguised that pump as an ordinary walking muscle. Every step you take squeezes it. You have been running your second heart your whole life without once thinking about it, the way you breathe without deciding to. And now let me give you the number that, for me, settles the whole argument about how much this matters. When you are up and moving, walking across a room, strolling down a street, going about an ordinary day on your feet, the return of blood from your legs back towards your chest is not mainly the work of your heart at all. Roughly 9/10 of it, about 90% of the venous return from your lower body during walking, is done by this skeletal muscle pump, by the squeezing of the calf and the muscles working with it on step after step. Your chest heart, the famous one, the one everybody worries about, is doing only a sliver of the uphill lifting from your legs while you walk. The humble hidden fish-shaped muscle in the back of your calf is doing the overwhelming bulk of it. 9 parts out of 10. Think of that the next time somebody tells you the heart is the only pump in the body. It is the only one they gave a name to in school. So here is a thought I want you to turn over gently in the dark. If 9/10 of the uphill work depends on that muscle actually contracting, actually squeezing, actually moving, then what on earth happens when it stops moving? What happens on the long day of standing still we began with? What happens across the hours of sitting at a desk, the way so many people spend their lives now? What happens on a long journey where you are folded into a seat and cannot stretch your legs hour after hour, the calf never firing, the sponge never squeezed? The answer is exactly what the plumbing tells you must happen. The pump goes quiet. The reservoirs in the soleus fill up and stay full. Nobody is wringing out the sponge, and that 90% of the return that depended on the muscle simply does not get lifted. So the blood pools. It sits. It stagnates in the deep sinuses of the calf, warm and still and going nowhere, and the tall pressure column we spoke of reassembles itself in full. 90 of those old units of pressure loaded onto the walls of veins that were never built to hold that load without help. The muscle was supposed to relieve them dozens of times a minute. Now it relieves them not at all. That stagnation, that quiet pooling in a pump that has fallen still, is the doorway to the whole family of troubles that people blame, wrongly, on simply getting old. It has a name. When the muscle pump fails, whether from sitting still for years, or from a life grown sedentary, or from the muscle itself growing weak and small with the decades, the blood chronically fails to get back up out of the legs. The doctors call that chronic venous insufficiency, and I will unfold for you later exactly what it feels like from the inside. Because you very likely know the feeling even if you never knew its name. The heaviness. The ankles that thicken by evening. The dull ache that has no sharp cause. The legs that feel, at the end of a still day, as though they have quietly turned to lead. All of that begins right here, in a pump that was designed to run all day long and was allowed to sit idle. But before we follow the failure down into the leg, I want you to hold on to the hopeful shape of this, because it is the whole secret of the talk, and it is almost embarrassingly simple. The pump is not broken by mystery. It is quieted by stillness. And a pump that is quieted by stillness is woken by motion. There is no drug in that sentence. There is no surgery in it. There is no machine you must buy. The engine is already installed in the back of your leg, 4,000 and more veins of it, thousands of little reservoirs of stored blood, waiting, fully built, fully paid for, the single most engineered piece of plumbing you will ever own. It asks only one thing of you. It asks you to contract, to lift the heel, to take the step, to move. So now I have shown you the poles that hold the ratchet, the valves, and I have shown you the engine that turns it, the soleus and its hidden warehouse of blood. What I have not yet shown you is the thing an engineer always wants to see next. Not the parts, the performance. How much does one squeeze actually move? How far does one step actually drop that murderous 90 units of pressure? Because it is a fine thing to admire a pump, but I am a physicist, and I do not truly believe in a pump until somebody has stuck a needle in and measured what comes out of it. And it turns out somebody has. So let us go, very carefully, to the single instant a heel leaves the floor, and let us count. Here is what they found when they put the needle in. Stand a person up, hold them perfectly still, And the pressure down at the ankle sits at that number we keep coming back to, about 90 millimeters of mercury. That is the loaded column, the full weight of the liquid rope hanging from the heart down to the foot. Now ask that same person to walk. Just walk. An ordinary pace, nothing athletic, the kind of stroll you do while looking for your keys. And within a handful of steps, the pressure at that same spot in the same vein falls to less than 25 millimeters of mercury. Think about what that means. The pressure drops by more than 60%, not by a little, by more than half, and then some. In a few seconds of the most ordinary human motion there is, the leg unloads 2/3 of the burden it was carrying while it stood there doing nothing. That lower number has a name. The people who study this call it the ambulatory venous pressure, which is a mouthful, so let us just call it the walking pressure. It is the single most honest report card the leg can hand you. A young, healthy leg with tight valves and a strong soleus takes that 90 and crushes it down under 25. And here is the quiet, beautiful part. Nobody told the leg to do that. There is no dial, no conscious command. You simply moved, and the machinery did the arithmetic for you, subtracting pressure with every contraction the way a bucket brigade empties a flooded cellar without any single person feeling like they lifted much at all. But I promised you an engineer's number, and a percentage is not quite enough for me. I want to know the volume. How much blood does one squeeze actually shove out of the calf? So somebody built a careful model of a segment of calf vein, a piece about 30 centimeters long, roughly the length of your shin, and they let it contract the way the muscle would, and they measured what came out the top. The answer was about 0.2 of 1 milliliter per cycle. 0.2 of a milliliter. That sounds like nothing. That is a few drops. You would not notice it spilled on a countertop. And yet, listen to what happens when you compare it to rest. When the leg is quiet, blood dribbles up out of that segment at a lazy trickle. When the pump fires, the flow through that same stretch of vein jumps to 4 times what it was sitting still. 4 times from a motion so gentle you would not spill a cup of coffee doing it. And then, because scientists are wonderfully stubborn people, somebody went and checked the model against a real leg. They measured the output of an actual posterior tibial vein, one of the deep drain pipes running behind the shin bone during a single contraction, and the number came back at about 0.2 of a milliliter again, almost exactly what the model predicted, about 0.22 if you want to be fussy about it. I love it when that happens. The theory and the flesh agree to within a hair. That is when you know you are not fooling yourself. Now, here is a way to feel how good this pump really is. Engineers have a word for pumps. They talk about the ejection fraction, which is just the fraction of whatever is inside that gets pushed out in one stroke. Your own heart, that famous fist-sized muscle in your chest that we give all the credit to, ejects a bit more than half of the blood in its chamber with each beat, and we consider that a marvel of biological design. Well, your calf, this thing you never think about, this lump of muscle you use to stand on your toes to reach the top shelf, ejects more than 60% of the venous blood held inside it on every single contraction. More than 60%. Your calf, by that one measure, is a better pump than your heart. It just works part-time. It only pumps when you ask it to, and most of us sitting still all day almost never ask. So let me draw the whole picture one step for you now, slowly, the way you might watch a waveform and break if you had all the time in the world. The heel comes up off the floor. The gastrocnemius and the soleus tighten together. Deep inside the soleus, those thin-walled reservoirs, those soft sinuses swollen with stored blood, get squeezed like a sponge in a closing fist. The blood has nowhere to go but up, because down below the valves have already snapped shut. It rushes cranially toward the heart, and the pressure in the foot below it collapses. Then the foot swings forward, the muscle relaxes, and within half a second to a full second, the valves above click closed again, holding the gains, refusing to let a single drop slide back down. And the reservoirs, now empty, begin to fill again from below, patiently waiting for the next step to send them upward once more. Squeeze, lift, hold, refill. Squeeze, lift, hold, refill. Every step you have ever taken has been running this cycle, silently, faithfully, and you never once had to think about it. Now I want to slow down and look at a piece of this that fooled people for a long time, because it is the kind of thing that delights me. You would think, wouldn't you, that the whole job of the calf pump is simply to push blood upward, up the leg, toward the heart, against gravity. Cranial, as the anatomists say. And that is certainly part of it. But some very careful work, quite recent, only from the last year or two, showed that the pump is cleverer than a simple bottom-to-top squeeze. It also moves blood sideways. Let me explain what I mean by sideways because it matters. Your leg has two venous systems. There is a superficial system, the veins running just under the skin, the ones you can sometimes see faintly blue on the back of a hand or an ankle. And there is a deep system, the big drain pipes buried inside the muscle. Between them run little connecting channels called perforating veins, perforators, because they perforate straight through the sheet of tissue that separates shallow from deep. And what the new measurements showed is that when you walk at a decent clip, the pump does not just lift blood, it diverts it. It pulls blood out of the lazy superficial veins near the skin, drives it through those perforators, and dumps it into the deep muscular veins where the real pumping power lives. It is acting like a switch operator in a rail yard, shunting cars off the slow siding onto the fast main line. A flow diverter, they called it. Not just a lift, a redirection. And when you push the pace up, when your stride frequency climbs to something like 75 to 90 cycles a minute, a brisk walk, the pressure inside those deep intramuscular veins drops towards something astonishing. It approaches near zero. Near zero. Imagine that. Inside the muscle, at the very moment of the working stride, the pressure in the vein falls almost to nothing, which means blood from everywhere else in the leg is being sucked toward that low-pressure zone the way air rushes toward a vacuum. The muscle is not only pushing from below, it is pulling from all around. And where does the pulling come from? Here is the part almost nobody expects. It comes from the front of your shin. The muscle on the front of the lower leg, the anterior tibial muscle, the one that lifts your toes up when your foot is swinging forward through the air between steps, that muscle contracts during the swing phase, and its contraction creates suction, real suction, drawing blood out of the superficial system. So while the back of your calf is doing the pushing during the stance phase, the front of your shin is doing the pulling during the swing phase. The two of them alternate, front and back, pull and push, in a rhythm so smooth you feel it as nothing more than walking. Now hold that thought, because it explains something that surprises a lot of well-meaning people. You might reasonably say, if the calf is the pump, then let me just work the calf. Let me stand up and do calf raises. Up on the toes, down again, up, down. Surely that is the pure concentrated version of the medicine. And it is good. It is genuinely good. But it is not as good as walking, and now you can see exactly why. When they measured the pressure in the great saphenous vein, the long superficial vein that runs up the inside of the leg, during isolated calf raises, the time average pressure was about 50% higher than it was during walking at the same rhythm. 50% higher pressure means 50% worse unloading. The calf raise fires the back of the leg beautifully, the push, but it leaves the front of the shin mostly idle, so you lose the pull, you lose the suction, you lose the swing phase vacuum that walking gives you for free. Walking engages both halves of the lower leg, front and back, push and pull, in their natural alternating dance. The isolated exercise only plays half the instrument. That is the sort of thing that makes me smile, because it means the humblest possible activity, the one your ancestors did to cross a field and your body was quite literally shaped over millions of years to perform, turns out to be more finely tuned than the deliberate exercise you would invent in a gymnasium to replace it. Nature got there first, and it got there better. You cannot really improve on the step. You can only do more of them. So we have a machine now, fully assembled in your mind. A tall loaded column of liquid, 90 units of pressure waiting at the ankle. A ladder of one-way valves ready to segment that column into harmless little rungs. A powerful reservoir-loaded pump in the calf that ejects more of its contents than your own heart does. And a two-part rhythm, front pulling, back pushing, that drives the whole thing whenever you move. It is elegant. It is overbuilt. It is frankly one of the finest pieces of engineering you will ever be handed for free at birth. But every machine, no matter how fine, wears. Bearings loosen. Seals stiffen. Gaskets crack. And this machine is no exception. So the question that ought to be forming in your mind now, the uncomfortable one, is this. What exactly goes wrong? What is it, precisely, that begins to fail as the years pile up, that turns a leg that could crush 90 down to 25 into a leg that carries its weight around like wet sand? Let us take the machine apart again, one wearing piece at a time, and find out where the trouble starts. Start with the pipe itself, the vein wall, because that is where the wearing shows first. If you could slice one of these veins across, clean through, and look at the cut end the way you look at the rings of a felled tree, you would not see one wall. You would see three, nested one inside the other, each with its own job. The innermost is a smooth, glistening lining, thinner than tissue paper, laid down so the blood slides past without catching. Around that sits a middle coat, a wrapping of muscle and springy elastic fiber that lets the vein widen and narrow, that gives it tone, that lets it hold its shape against the pressure inside. And around that, on the outside, a tougher, fibrous jacket that anchors the whole thing to the flesh it runs through. 3 coats, a liner, a spring, and a jacket. And here is the melancholy fact of it. All 3 wear, and they do not wear together, and they do not wear in the same way. Take the inner lining first. In a young leg it is orderly. The little elastic fibers woven into it run in neat, sensible directions, the way the grain runs true in a good plank of wood. As the decades stack up, that lining thickens, and the fibers lose their sense of direction. They tangle. They point every which way. The neat grain becomes a knot. The surface that was mirror smooth grows rough and heaped. Now think about what a rough, thickened lining does to the delicate business happening inside. Everything in this system depended on smoothness, on the blood gliding, on the valve leaflets meeting cleanly. Roughen the runway and you have already begun to sabotage the machine. Move outward to the middle coat, the spring. In youth it is a balanced thing, muscle and elastic in fair proportion, so the vein can grip and give. With age the muscle in that coat swells, it hypertrophies, it grows out of proportion to what it needs to do, and the elastic fibers among it go bad. Dystrophic is the word the anatomists use, meaning starved, meaning malformed, meaning no longer springy in the way a spring must be. So the coat that was supposed to give the vein its snap and recoil turns into something bulkier and stiffer and stupider. And the outer jacket, the third ring, stiffens too, going hard and unyielding where it used to have a little life in it. A liner gone rough, a spring gone stiff, a jacket gone hard. That is the vein wall of an old leg, and I have not even gotten to the valves yet. But of course it all comes down to the valves, because the valves were the whole trick. Remember the trick. One tall, dangerous column of pressure cut into a stack of short, harmless little segments by these 2 delicate leaflets sitting in their little pockets, each pair closing the instant the muscle above relaxes, each pair holding up its own short rung of the ladder so no single point down at the ankle ever has to bear the full weight of the whole column. That trick is exquisite, and it depends on one thing above all others. The 2 leaflets have to meet. They have to swing shut and touch, edge to edge, in the middle of the vein, and seal. If they meet, the segment holds. If they do not quite meet, if they come swinging in and fall just short of each other, then you have left a gap down the center, and through that gap the blood slides backward, down, the wrong way, toward the foot. Now watch how the wearing of the wall reaches in and spoils the valves. The leaflets themselves are anchored in the vein wall, seated in that little widened pouch, that dilated sinus, where the vein bulges out just enough to give them room to open and stow. When the wall stiffens and thickens and swells, the geometry of that pouch changes. The vein itself, under years of high pressure, widens. And here is the cruelty of geometry. The leaflets are only so long. They were sized to reach across a vein of a certain width. Widen the vein, stretch the walls apart, and the leaflets, which have not grown, can no longer bridge the gap. They reach for each other and fall short. The seal is broken. The blood leaks back. And the moment the blood leaks back, you have handed the disease the one thing it wanted, because it is now a loop, and the loop feeds itself. Let me walk you around that loop slowly, because it is the heart of the whole sad story, and once you see it turning, you cannot unsee it. A valve leaks a little. Blood that should have stayed up in its segment falls back down into the segment below. That lower segment now holds more blood than it was meant to, and more blood means more pressure, and more pressure pushes outward on the wall, and the wall, already softened and stiffened by age, stretches a little wider. But a wider vein is exactly the vein whose leaflets cannot meet. So the next valve down, feeling that extra pressure, widens too, and its leaflets fall short too, and it begins to leak, which drops still more blood onto the segment below that. Higher pressure widens the vein, a wider vein leaks worse, leaking worse raises the pressure higher. Round and round. Each turn of the loop makes the next turn worse. Engineers have a name for a loop like that. They call it positive feedback, which is a terrible name, because there is nothing positive about it. It means runaway. It means the thing accelerates its own ruin. Sustained high pressure in the veins, what the doctors call venous hypertension, is not just a symptom of the failure. It is the engine of the failure. It drives itself. And now think about who is standing at the bottom of that column while the loop spins. The foot. The ankle. The lowest segments, the ones that in a healthy leg during walking were dropping down to 25 units of pressure or less, are now, with the valves leaking and the pump weakening, sitting up near 90 again even when you move, because the segmenting trick has broken and the tall column has reassembled itself. The ladder has lost its rungs. It is one long drop again, and the tissues down there, the skin and the fat and the fine little vessels of the ankle, were never built to live under 90 units of pressure all day long. They were promised relief every time you took a step. When the relief stops coming, they begin to suffer. The fluid that the pressure squeezes out of the vessels has nowhere to go, and it pools, and the ankle thickens, and the leg grows heavy, and by evening the sock leaves a deep ring in the flesh that takes an hour to fade. This is the thing they call chronic venous insufficiency, and I want to tell you how common it is, because the number is genuinely startling and almost nobody knows it. If you gather up all the adults in a country like this one and examine their legs honestly, somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 3 of them show signs of this failing venous system. And it climbs steeply with age. There was a large, careful study done, the Gutenberg Health Study, that looked at adults between 40 and 80 years old and found that more than 40% of them, more than 4 in every 10, had clinical signs or symptoms of this condition. 4 in 10. In men past 50, the rate runs around 20 to 21%, 1 in 5, and in women past 50 it runs higher still. And at the far end of it, in the frailest cases, roughly 4% of people over 65 develop open sores on the leg, venous ulcers, wounds that will not heal because the pressure underneath them never lets up. That is where the broken loop finally leads if it turns long enough. And here is what I find almost unbearable about it. As a matter of plain human misunderstanding, for most of the people carrying these heavy, aching, swollen legs around, nobody ever names what is happening. They feel the heaviness at the end of the day. They feel the ache creep up the calf. And they say to themselves, well, I am getting old, legs get tired, that is just how it is. They file it under aging, the great wastebasket where we throw everything we have decided not to look at closely. But it is not simply aging, in the sense of some vague, inevitable dimming. It is a specific, measurable, mechanical failure of a specific, beautiful pump. It has a pressure you can read off a gauge, it has an ejection fraction you can measure, it has valves you can watch leaking on a screen. It is physics, gone wrong in a way physics can describe exactly. And the reason that matters, the reason I am dwelling on it, is that a thing you can measure and describe is a thing you might be able to change. A wastebasket labeled just getting old you cannot do anything about. A pump running at 75% of the volume it should be moving, a column that has lost its rungs, a set of leaflets falling just short of meeting, those are problems with a shape. and a problem with a shape can have a solution with a shape. So before we lose heart entirely watching this machine wear down, let me put a hard number on exactly how much the failing pump gives up, because the size of the loss turns out to be the first clue to the size of the fix. Think about what 75% really means, because the number is deceptively gentle. A pump that runs at 75% of its proper volume sounds almost fine. It sounds like a car that still starts, a faucet that still runs, a tired but working thing. But circulation is not a single event. It is a repetition. That calf squeezes and releases thousands of times in a day of ordinary living. And a small deficit paid over and over on every contraction for every waking hour for years is not small at all. It is the difference between a reservoir that empties and refills cleanly and one that always keeps a little pool at the bottom, a residue that never quite leaves. The healthy calf, remember, throws out more than 6/10 of the blood sitting in its deep sinuses on a single squeeze. The failing one in chronic venous disease gives up roughly a quarter of that ejecting power. And when the valves go truly incompetent, the net volume moved on one cycle falls from about 2/10 of a milliliter down to about 14/100 of a milliliter. Say those two numbers slowly and they seem like nothing. 2/10, 14/100. Drops. You could not see the difference on your fingertip. But the leg does not deal in single drops. It deals in the accumulated arithmetic of a lifetime, and against that arithmetic even a drop, withheld again and again, becomes a flood that never drains. That is why the leg feels heavy. Not because of some vague weariness of age, but because there is, quite literally, more blood standing in it than there ought to be, held there by a pump that no longer quite finishes its stroke. The heaviness is mass. The ache is pressure on tissue that was never built to hold that pressure for that long. The swelling at the ankle by evening is fluid pushed out through vessel walls straining under a column that the pump failed to shorten. Every one of those sensations, which people file under the soft, hopeless heading of getting old, is a readout. It is the body reporting a mechanical fact, in the only language it has, which is discomfort. And the moment you understand it as a readout, something shifts. You stop asking, "Why do I feel this way?" as if it were a mood. You start asking, "What is the machine doing and what would make it do better?" Those are answerable questions. They have been answered, in fact, by people with pressure catheters and ultrasound probes and water tanks to measure the swelling of a limb. And the answers all point, with an almost embarrassing simplicity, in one direction. Let me hold you in the suspense of it a little longer, though, because I do not want to hand you the fix as if it were a slogan. If I just tell you the answer in 4 words, you will nod, and you will forget, and nothing in you will have changed. I want you to feel why the answer has to be what it is. So let us stay with the broken pump and ask a sharper question. When the pump weakens, what precisely fails first? Is it the muscle, the meat that does the squeezing? Is it the valves, the little leaflets that hold the gains between squeezes? Or is it the wall of the vein itself, the vessel that has to stay firm enough to be squeezed against? The honest answer is that they fail together, in a conspiracy each one dragging the others down. But there is an order to it, a sequence you can trace, and tracing it tells you exactly where a simple intervention gets its leverage. Begin with the valves, because they are the most fragile actors in the whole drama. A valve leaflet is a wisp. It is thinner than paper, a fold of tissue anchored at the base of that little widened pocket in the vein where the sinus bulges out. When it is young and healthy, the 2 leaflets swing shut and meet cleanly in the middle, edge to edge, sealing the vein like 2 halves of a saloon door pulled tight. Now let the vein wall behind them stretch, just a little, the way an old waistband stretches. The anchoring points of those 2 leaflets drift apart. And here is the cruelty of the geometry. The leaflets themselves do not grow to compensate. They are the size they are. So as the wall widens, the 2 free edges reach for each other and fall short. A gap opens down the center. It need not be a large gap. A hair's breadth is enough. Through that hair's breadth, when the muscle relaxes and the blood above wants to fall back down, it falls. The valve that was meant to catch it and hold it lets it slip through. And every drop that slips back down is a drop the pump has to lift all over again on the next stroke. The pump is now doing the same work, but keeping less of it. That is the leak. That is reflux. And you can watch it happen on an ultrasound screen, a little backward shimmer of flow where there should be stillness, time to the relaxation of the calf. Notice what caused the leak, though. It was not the leaflet tearing, it was the wall widening. So the real culprit sits one layer deeper, in the vein wall itself, in those 3 concentric rings we walked through. And here the villain is pressure. Sustained pressure. The very hydrostatic column we started with, the 90 millimeters of mercury standing patiently in a motionless leg, is what slowly stretches the wall that misaligns the valves that permit the reflux, that raises the pressure, that stretches the wall a little more. Do you hear the shape of that sentence? It bites its own tail. It is a loop that feeds itself. Higher pressure widens the vein. A wider vein means valves that meet less well. Worse valves mean more blood falling back and pooling. More pooling means higher pressure still. Around and around, each turn of the wheel a fraction worse than the last, over years so gradual that no single day announces the decline. This is why the trouble creeps up on people. There is no morning you wake and find your legs have failed. There is only the slow tightening of a screw you cannot feel turning. Now I have drawn you a rather bleak machine, a self-worsening spiral with pressure as its engine, and you might reasonably ask whether such a loop can ever be broken. A thing that feeds itself seems designed to run forever in one direction. But look again at what powers the spiral. It is pressure. It is the standing column. And we already know, from the very numbers we laid down earlier, that there exists something which reaches into that column and cuts it down by more than half in seconds using no medicine and no machine. The calf pump, when it fires, takes 90 millimeters of mercury at the ankle and drops it below 25. That is not a modest nudge. That is the single most powerful lever anyone has ever found for lowering the pressure in a human leg, and it is built into your own body, sitting idle behind your shin bone, waiting for you to use it. So the spiral has a weak point after all. The loop is driven by pressure, and pressure is exactly the thing motion destroys. Every time the calf contracts and the valves catch the gains, the column is broken into short, low-pressure segments, and for those moments the wall is no longer being stretched by 90 millimeters of standing blood. It gets to rest at a fraction of that load. Do it once, and the relief is temporary, gone the moment you stand still again. But do it habitually, thousands of times a day, day after day, and you are no longer merely relieving the pressure. You are changing the average pressure the wall lives under across its whole life. And walls, blood vessel walls, respond to the average conditions they experience. This is the crack of light in the bleak machine. The loop that feeds itself can be starved. You starve it of the standing pressure that drives it, by refusing to stand still, by moving, by letting the second heart do the job the first heart cannot reach. I am being careful here not to overpromise, because a stretched vein does not unstretch overnight, and a valve that has fallen truly incompetent does not grow new tissue to close its gap. Some of the damage, once done, is done. But that is not the whole story of the leg, not by a long way, because the vein wall is only the plumbing. Wrapped around that plumbing, and lining it and feeding it, is living tissue that is astonishingly responsive to how you use it. There is the muscle itself, which can be made stronger and can squeeze harder. There are the tiny arteries that feed the leg, which can be coaxed to widen and even to multiply. There is a single molecule, made by the innermost lining of every vessel, a whisper of a gas that tells the walls to relax and stay supple, and whose production rises and falls with something as ordinary as the drag of moving blood against the vessel lining. And there are the little furnaces inside the muscle cells, the ones that turn food and oxygen into the power for every contraction, which can be woken from their aging sluggishness in a matter of hours by a single honest bout of work. Each of these is a lever. Each of them answers to motion, and when we take them one at a time and watch what a moving leg does to each of them, you will see that the picture is not one of slow surrender at all. It is a picture of a system practically begging to be used and rewarding use with a generosity that borders on the miraculous, except that there is nothing miraculous about it. It is just physics and chemistry and a body doing exactly what it was shaped over countless generations to do. So let us start with the smallest and strangest of these levers, the invisible molecule. And I mean invisible in the most literal sense, because it is a gas, and it exists for barely a breath before it vanishes. Picture that single cell for a moment. It is one of millions lining the inside of a small artery in your calf, flat and thin, laid down like a tile on a floor, and it spends its whole life with a river running over its face. That river is your blood, and it does not flow gently past the cell the way a breeze passes a leaf. It drags. It pulls sideways along the surface, and that sideways pull has a name. We call it shear stress, which is just a fancy way of saying the friction of a fluid sliding across a wall. Now you might think a cell would hate that, would want to hide from it, but no. This cell is listening for it. It has grown over all those generations I keep mentioning to treat that drag as a message. And when the blood moves fast and smooth and steady, laminar we call it, in nice orderly layers, the cell reads the message and it does something quietly astonishing. It manufactures a gas. The gas is nitric oxide, one atom of nitrogen, one atom of oxygen, holding hands for the briefest instant. And I want you to feel how strange that is, because we are not used to thinking of the body as a place that makes gases on purpose to send little notes to itself. But that is exactly what happens. The cell has a machine in it, an enzyme, and the people who study these things gave it a name that is a mouthful: endothelial nitric oxide synthase. You do not need to hold the whole name, just hold the idea. It is a tiny factory whose only job is to take the raw materials floating by and stitch together this one small molecule of gas. And the trigger that turns the factory on, more than almost anything else, is that steady drag of moving blood. So the gas is made, and it slips out of the cell, and it drifts the short distance into the muscular wall of the vessel, the ring of smooth muscle wrapped around the tube. And it whispers to that muscle one word: relax. And the muscle loosens its grip, and the vessel opens a little wider, and now more blood can pass, and the whole leg is fed a little better. That is the dilating job, the opening job, and it is the famous one. But the gas does a second thing, quieter and slower, and in some ways more important. It signals maintenance. It tells the wall to keep itself in good repair, to resist the little inflammations and stiffenings that otherwise creep in. It is, if you like, both the traffic officer and the janitor, and it lives for less than a single breath before it is gone and must be made again. Now here is the sad part, and I will not dress it up, because the sadness is what makes the fix so beautiful when we get to it. As we age, this factory runs down. The making of the gas falls off. Fewer of the little machines, and the ones that remain work less well, and the gas that does get made is often destroyed before it can deliver its message. Destroyed by what? By a class of troublemakers the chemists call reactive oxygen species, which is a grand name for a handful of restless, greedy molecules that go around grabbing electrons off of everything they pass. They are a byproduct of ordinary living, of burning fuel with oxygen, and in a young and well-run body they are mopped up almost as fast as they appear. But in an aging or a sedentary body they pile up, and when they meet a molecule of nitric oxide they wreck it on contact. So you have less gas being made and more of it being smashed, and the leg loses both its traffic officer and its janitor at once. The vessels do not open as readily, the maintenance falls behind. This is a real and measurable piece of what we casually call vascular aging. And you would think, would you not, that once such a decline sets in it only goes one direction. That is the whole assumption I have been trying to loosen in your mind tonight. Because it does not only go one direction. Watch what movement does. When you walk, when you set that river of blood running faster and smoother over the faces of all those tile-like cells, you crank up the very shear stress that switches the factory back on. The steady drag returns, and the cells read the message, and they build more of the machinery, and they make more of the gas. And at the very same time, the exercise tamps down the production of those electron-grabbing troublemakers so less of the gas gets destroyed. Both problems eased by the same simple act. More made, less broken. The traffic officer comes back to his corner. The janitor picks up his broom. I do not want you to take that on my word alone, Because the loveliest thing about all of this is that people have actually measured it, and measurement is the only thing that separates a nice story from the truth. There is a way to gauge how much oxidative damage is happening in a body. You look for the fingerprints those troublemakers leave behind, a marker in the blood that the chemists track, one of a family they call the F2 isoprostanes. When the electron grabbers have been busy, this fingerprint rises. When they have been kept in check, it falls. And in one careful trial that ran a full 12 months, a whole year, they split people into two groups. One group exercised. One group stayed sedentary, living as before. And at the end, they measured the fingerprint. In the group that moved, the marker of oxidative stress had gone down. In the group that sat, it had gone up. A year of stillness pushed the number the wrong way. A year of motion pulled it back. Same bodies, same aging clock ticking for everyone, and the only difference in the arithmetic was whether the legs had been used. Sit with that a moment, because it is the whole thesis in miniature. The decline is real. And the decline answers to motion, not to a drug, not to a surgery, not to some clever molecule brewed in a laboratory and sold at great expense, though those things have their place. It answers, first and most cheaply, to the plain act of putting one foot in front of the other and letting the river run. Now I have given you the invisible molecule, and I have given you its rise and fall and rise again. But you may fairly ask me a bigger question. All right, the gas is a lever, fine. But how do we put a number on the whole leg, on the whole aging artery, and say, this vessel is so many years old, and this one, after some weeks of work, is younger? Because that is a bold claim, that you can reverse years, and a bold claim deserves a real ruler held up against it. And there is such a ruler. It is one of the prettiest measurements in all of medicine, and it turns the stiffness of your arteries into something you can time with a good clock. So let me set the gas aside, gently, and pick up that ruler. Because to understand it, you have to think for a moment, not about the blood as a slow river, but about the blood as something that carries a wave. Every time your heart beats, it does not simply push a slug of fluid forward and wait. It slams a pressure pulse into the top of the great artery, the aorta, the big pipe leaving the heart, and that pulse then travels down the length of you like a wave running down a rope you have snapped at one end. You have felt this wave your whole life without naming it. It is your pulse. When you press two fingers to your wrist and feel that gentle knock, 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 you are not feeling blood arriving. The blood itself moves far slower than that. You are feeling the pressure wave, the snap of the rope, having raced down from the heart and reached your wrist. And here is the thing that makes it a ruler. The speed of that wave depends, almost entirely, on how stiff the walls of the pipe are. Think of the rope again, or better, think of a long garden hose lying across the grass. If the hose is soft and springy and full of give, and you snap one end, the wave travels down it slowly, because the walls absorb it and pass it along lazily, bulging out to take the pulse and settling back. But if that same hose is old and hard and sun-stiffened, brittle almost, then snap the end and the wave cracks down its whole length in a flash. Because a stiff wall does not absorb, it transmits. Right now, no give, no delay. So the speed of the wave is a direct readout of the softness of the pipe. A young artery is the springy hose, an old artery is the stiff one, and the wave does not lie. You measure how long it takes the pulse to travel from one point on the body to another unknown distance away. You do a little division, distance divided by time, and out comes a speed. They call it the pulse wave velocity. And that single number, that speed in meters per second, is one of the finest measures we have of how old, in the way that matters, your arteries truly are. So now we have our ruler. And the question that ought to be burning in you, the question I would be asking if I was sitting where you are, is simple and enormous. If I move, if I walk, if I do the honest work, does the number go down? Does the stiff hose soften? Can you, with your own two legs, run the clock of your arteries backward, and if so, by how much and how fast? And the answer, which I will lay out for you carefully, because it is almost too good to state plainly, has been weighed and timed and written down. So let us hold the ruler steady against a real leg and read it. Here is what the timing shows, and I want you to sit with it slowly, because it is one of those results that sounds like a wish and turns out to be a measurement. When a person takes up honest aerobic movement and stays with it, the pulse wave velocity comes down. Not by some trivial sliver you would have to squint at, by something between half a meter per second and 1.5 meters per second. That is the range that has been read off the machines over and over in the space of about 8 to 16 weeks of steady work. 2 months, 4 months, a season of your life. And that drop, that softening of the hose, corresponds to peeling somewhere between 5 and 15 years off the age of your arteries. Read that again in your mind. You can, with nothing more elaborate than a pair of legs and the willingness to use them, hand yourself back a decade of vascular youth in the span of a summer. Now I am a suspicious fellow by nature, and when somebody tells me a number that good, my first instinct is to hunt for the trick. So let us hunt for it together. The first thing you want to know is whether the improvement is real or whether it is hiding inside some other change. Maybe you think the people who exercise just lowered their blood pressure and the softer artery is only an illusion born of the lower pressure squeezing it less. That is a fine objection. It is exactly the sort of thing that ought to worry you. And it was checked. A fellow named Tanaka and his colleagues took middle-aged men and set them to their training, and within 3 months they saw the arterial compliance improve, the vessel grow genuinely more supple, and the blood pressure had not budged. The pressure stayed put while the wall itself changed, so the softening was not a trick of the gauge. It was the material itself becoming young again, or something close enough to young that the ruler cannot tell the difference. Consider what a strange and marvelous thing that is. You have a length of biological tubing that has spent years slowly turning to rope, its elastic threads going stiff and disorderly, and you do not repair it with a scalpel or a drug or a clever molecule brewed in a laboratory. You repair it with rhythm, with the simple insistence of moving blood, again and again, day after day, until the wall remembers what it is supposed to be. And the size of the reward is not sentimental. A drop in pulse wave velocity of merely half a meter per second, somewhere in that neighborhood of 0.5 to 0.75 meters per second, all by itself lowers the risk of cardiovascular disease by something like 6 to 10%. That is a whole slice of danger, shaved off for the price of walking. But I promised you I would hold this ruler against a real leg, and a leg is not only its arteries. A leg is meat and machinery, and the machinery runs on tiny engines, and I want to take you down now to where those engines live, because there the story gets even stranger and even faster. You would think, would you not, that undoing years of decline would take years of effort, that the body would pay you back only slowly, grudgingly, one grinding week at a time. And for some of it, yes, that is the arithmetic. But not for all of it. Some of the repair begins almost the instant you start moving, and I mean within the hour, which is a fact that still delights me every time I turn it over. Go down then into a muscle fiber of the calf, into a fiber that belongs to someone who is no longer young. Inside it, scattered like little furnaces through the cell, are the mitochondria. These are the power plants. They take in fuel and oxygen, and they burn it, gently, without flame, and out of that burning, they mint the energy currency the cell spends on everything it does. As we age, these furnaces bank their fires. They respire more sluggishly, they make less. It is one of the quiet reasons old legs feel tired and heavy in a way that has nothing to do with the veins we have been discussing. The engines themselves have gone dim. So somebody did the honest experiment. They took a group of older people, 22 of them in all, and split them into those with healthy circulation and those whose legs suffered from poor arterial supply. And they had them do a simple, humble thing. Calf raises. Up on the toes, down again. The very motion your foot makes 10,000 times a day without a thought. And then they went in and measured what the mitochondria were doing, not months later, but minutes later. 15 minutes after the exercise, in the healthy older adults, mitochondrial respiration had climbed by about 35%. 15 minutes. Your furnaces, banked and dim, flare up by better than a third almost as soon as you ask them to work. And by 24 hours, in certain measures of that respiration, the gain reached something like 45%. The muscle did not merely burn brighter during the exercise and then fall back. It kept climbing through the following day as though the single session were a message that arrived and set carpenters to work overnight. And here is the part that ought to make you sit up, gently, without disturbing your rest. The people with the poorest circulation, the ones whose muscle engines started out the most starved, whose baseline respiration in one key part of the machinery ran a full 40% below the healthy group, they did not respond less. They responded more. 1 hour after their calf raises, a particular measure of how efficiently their engines coupled the burning of fuel to the making of energy did not rise by a third or a half. It rose by 3.5 times. Threefold and then some in a single hour in the very people you would have bet had the least capacity left to improve. The furnace that had fallen furthest jumped the highest when someone finally struck the match. I want you to feel why that inverts your expectations so completely. We carry around this picture, most of us, that the body is like an old machine wearing out, and that every year takes something you cannot get back, and that the best you can hope for is to slow the losing. But that is not what the measurements say about the calf. They say the capacity for renewal is sitting there, coiled and waiting even in tissue that looks spent, and that it answers not to some grand medical intervention, but to the plainest movement there is. The engines were never gone. They were only idle. And idleness, it turns out, is not the same as ruin. Idleness can be spoken to. It answers within the hour. Now let me draw these two rulers together, the slow one and the fast one, because between them they tell you the whole shape of the repair. On the slow time scale, the time scale of weeks and months, the great stiff pipes of the body soften, the pulse wave gentles its pace, and you win back your decade. That is the structural work, the patient remodeling of walls, the growing of new small vessels to carry blood where the old roads have narrowed. It cannot be rushed. It arrives on its own calendar, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16. But on the fast time scale, the time scale of a single afternoon, the engines inside the muscle wake and brighten, the burning improves, the tired fiber begins to feel less tired. And you do not have to wait a season for that one. You get a down payment on the very first day. Think of what that means for the person standing on the kitchen floor at the end of the long day, the one we began with, feet aching, ankles thick, the 90-millimeter column of pressure standing full and unbroken from heel to heart. That person does not have to believe in a distant reward to begin. The first walk pays. The furnaces answer that same evening, and if the walking continues, if it becomes a rhythm rather than a resolution, then the slow ruler starts to move too, and one measurement at a time, week by quiet week, the arteries themselves grow young. So we have watched the pulse wave slow, and we have watched the little engines flare, and you might think we have the whole account now. But there is a third thing I have been holding back, something that ties the fast engines to the slow walls, a single unassuming molecule that the moving blood itself calls into being. A molecule so small and so fleeting that it lives only seconds before it vanishes, and yet without it none of the softening, none of the widening, none of the repair could happen at all. It is made right there on the inner skin of the vessel, made by the very rush of blood sliding past, and its production falls away as we age for reasons we can name precisely. To see how walking reaches all the way down to that molecule, and how the sliding of blood against the living wall becomes a signal that the wall reads and obeys, we have to press our attention against a single cell, one cell, on the inside of one small artery, and ask what it feels as the river goes by. Picture that cell. It is flat, almost impossibly thin, laid down like a single tile on the inside of the vessel, and it is not alone. It has neighbors on every side, thousands of them, millions of them, all lying in the same direction, all facing the current, tiling the entire inner surface of every artery and every vein in your body the way scales tile the skin of a fish. This single layer has a name. We call it the endothelium, and if you could peel it out of a grown person and spread it flat on the ground, it would cover a startling amount of floor. It is the largest organ you have never heard anyone worry about, and its whole job, its entire reason for existing, is to sit at the boundary between the moving blood and the muscular wall, and to listen. Now what does it listen to? It listens to touch. It listens to the drag of the blood going by. When a river slides past a smooth bank, The water right against the bank moves slowly, and the water in the middle moves fast, and there is a shearing between the layers, one sheet of water sliding over the next. Blood does exactly the same thing. The layer of blood pressed right against our little tile is nearly still, held there by friction, and the blood a hair's width inward is racing along, and so the tile feels a gentle, steady tug along its surface, a sideways pull in the direction of flow. Engineers have a plain word for this tug. They call it shear stress. And here is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it is the hinge on which this whole story turns. That tug is not just wear and tear. That tug is a message. The cell can feel it, and the cell answers. How does it answer? When the blood slides fast and smooth and steady over the tile, the cell reads that steady sliding as a command, and it switches on a little piece of molecular machinery, a factory enzyme sitting in its membrane. This enzyme has a long, clumsy name, and I will give you the short version. We call it endothelial nitric oxide synthase, and all you need to remember is what it makes. It takes an ordinary building block that is floating around in the blood, and it snips off a piece and releases a gas. A gas. Right there inside your leg, a living cell manufactures a whiff of gas on demand. And the gas is nitric oxide, one atom of nitrogen married to one atom of oxygen, about as simple a molecule as nature bothers to make. And this little puff of gas does something lovely. It cannot stay in the blood, it will not last, it lives for only a few seconds before it is gone. But a few seconds is all it needs. It slips sideways, out of the blood, into the muscular wall of the vessel just underneath, and it whispers to the smooth muscle wrapped around the tube, and it says, "Let go. Relax. Loosen your grip." And the muscle obeys. The ring of muscle around the vessel eases, the tube widens, the channel opens a little more, and the blood flows through with less resistance. So the very act of blood rushing past causes the vessel to open wider for that blood. The flow creates the room for the flow. It is a beautiful little circle of cause and effect, the current asking the banks to step back, and the banks stepping back. But the gas does more than open the door for one afternoon. That same whisper tells the wall to keep itself in good repair. It quiets the little troublemakers that would otherwise cling to the wall and start to gum it up. It tells the smooth muscle not to pile up and thicken. It keeps the surface slick and clean and calm. So this fleeting gas, made fresh by motion, is not only the thing that widens your vessels in the moment. It is one of the great caretakers of the whole vascular household, sweeping the floors, oiling the hinges, keeping the walls from stiffening before their time. Now you can already feel where the trouble comes from, can you not? What happens to a wall that is rarely swept? A factory that is rarely asked to run? When we sit still, hour upon hour, day upon day, year upon year, the blood in the legs slows to a lazy ooze, and the sliding tug on our little tile fades to almost nothing, and the cell, feeling no steady message, lets its gas factory fall quiet. And here age lays its own hand on top of that. As the years pass, even in a person who moves, the making of this gas declines. The enzyme is expressed less. The gas that is made is more easily destroyed before it can do its work. There are little scavengers that build up in an aging, under-exercised vessel, hungry fragments of oxygen we call reactive oxygen species, and they pounce on the nitric oxide and tear it apart before it ever reaches the muscle it was meant to soothe. So you get a double loss. Less of the gas is made, and more of what is made is wrecked on the way. The caretaker is fired, and the vandals move in. And this is not a story, it is a measured thing. There was a careful trial that ran for a full 12 months, a whole year, following two groups of people. One group exercised, one group sat as they always had, and the scientists measured a particular fingerprint of that vessel damage, a marker that rises in the blood when those hungry oxygen fragments have been chewing on the tissues, a substance with the awkward name of F2-isoprostane, and you only need to know that more of it means more damage. Over the year, in the people who exercised, that marker went down. In the people who stayed sedentary, that same marker went up. The two groups walked away from that year with vessels moving in opposite directions. One set of walls was being cleaned, the other was being slowly corroded. Same 12 months of life, opposite outcomes, and the difference was motion. So now put it together, because the shape of it is worth sitting with. When you walk, the calf squeezes the deep veins and drives a slug of blood upward. We saw that. And it draws blood sideways out of the shallow veins. We saw that too. But all that extra blood you are moving has to come back down the arteries to feed the working muscle, and so the flow through those arteries climbs. And the faster, smoother rush drags harder on all those little tiles, and the tiles wake their gas factories, and the gas opens the arteries wider and tells the walls to mend themselves. Every step is not only a pump stroke. Every step is a message sent to millions of cells to make the molecule that keeps your vessels young. The pump and the gas are two halves of one machine, and both of them run on the same fuel, which is simply that you get up and move. There is a question a sharp person always asks at about this point, and I want to ask it for you before you drift off, because it is a good one. You say, all right, the gas opens the vessel in the moment, I believe you, but that is temporary. That lasts as long as the walk. Where is the lasting change? If I walk for weeks and months, does anything permanent happen to the wall itself? Or does it snap right back to being old and stiff the moment I sit down again? And the answer is that something does last. Something you can measure with a clock and a ruler, and it is one of the most quietly astonishing numbers in all of this. To see it, we have to leave the little tile behind for a moment and go up to the great vessel at the center of everything, the aorta, the main pipe leaving the heart. And we have to watch not the blood this time, but something faster than the blood, a wave. Because every time the heart beats, it does not just push blood forward like water in a hose. It slaps the wall of the aorta, and that slap sends a pulse running down the wall itself, a wave of stretch racing ahead of the actual blood, the way a shove at one end of a long rope sends a hump running down the rope while the rope fibers themselves barely move. That wave of stretch travels down the arterial tree, and it travels at a certain speed, and here is the whole secret. The speed of that wave depends on how stiff the wall is. A soft, young, springy artery lets the wave amble along. A hard, old, stiffened artery makes the wave race, because a stiff thing carries a wave faster than a soft thing does, the same way a sharp rap travels quicker through a steel rail than through a length of garden hose. So if you can measure how fast that pulse runs from one point on the body to another, you have measured directly, honestly, in plain meters per second, the youth of a person's arteries. Doctors do exactly this, and they call the number the pulse wave velocity. And a low number is young and a high number is old, and there is no fooling it. The wave does not care how you feel or what you tell yourself. It simply runs down the wall at the speed the wall allows, and it clocks your age in the walls, not the calendar. And now I can tell you the thing I have been walking you toward all this while, the payoff of the gas and the wave together, and it is this. That speed is not fixed. That number, which seems as if it ought to be a fact of how old you are, can be moved. It can be brought down. And when a person who has been still begins, week after week, to walk, the wave in their aorta begins measurably to slow. The wall is softening, and how much it softens, and how many years of stiffening it can undo, and how quickly is the question we take up next. Because the size of that number when you finally hear it is larger than almost anyone would guess. So let me give you the number, and let me give it to you slowly, because it is worth savoring. When a person who has been sitting still for years takes up steady walking, the kind of ordinary aerobic effort that leaves you a little warm and a little out of breath but not gasping, the speed of that pressure wave in the aorta comes down. And it comes down by something on the order of half a meter per second, and in some people by as much as 1.5 meters per second. That is the whole spread. Somewhere between 1/2 of a meter every second and 1.5 meters every second, the wave slows. And it does this not over a lifetime, not over a decade, but within roughly 8 to 16 weeks of consistent training. 2 months, maybe 4. A single season of the year. Now you may hear that and think, well, 1 meter per second, that is a small thing, that is a walking pace. What does it matter to me how fast a wave runs down a pipe I cannot see? So let me translate it into the currency that actually lands. That slowing of the wave, that softening of the wall, corresponds to peeling back somewhere between 5 and 15 years of vascular aging. Read that again in your mind slowly. 5 to 15 years. A body that had stiffened into the walls of a 60-year-old can in the arteries come to behave like the walls of a person a decade or more younger. And nothing was cut, nothing was injected, no pill was swallowed. A person simply walked most days for a couple of months, and the wall remembered how to be soft. I want to be honest with you, because I promised at the start that when I did not know a thing I would say so, and when a number was soft I would tell you it was soft. This is not a magic reversal to some childhood springiness. You do not walk your way back to the arteries you had at 17, and the exact number of years you recover depends on where you started, how stiff you had become, how faithfully you moved, and a dozen quiet things about your own particular body that no study can pin down for you personally. But the direction is not in doubt, and the size is not trivial. Even the small end of that range does real work. A drop in wave speed of only about half a meter to 3/4 of a meter per second all by itself lowers the risk of cardiovascular disease by something like 6 to 10%. That is not from feeling better. That is not from a hunch. That is the wave itself, clocking a younger wall, and the younger wall carrying a lower risk of the thing that kills more people than anything else. And there is a lovely, almost sneaky detail buried in this, the kind of detail I find delicious because it tells you the mechanism is real and not a trick of bookkeeping. When the careful people measured middle-aged men who took up this kind of aerobic movement, the arteries grew more compliant, more giving, more willing to stretch and rebound within about 3 months. And here is the sneaky part. Their blood pressure, the number the cuff reads on your arm, did not necessarily change. You could measure the same fellow, cuff on the arm, and read the same pressure as before, and conclude nothing had happened. But down inside the wall itself, in the springiness of the tube, everything had changed. The cuff was blind to it. Only the wave saw it. And that tells you something profound about why this whole business goes unnoticed for so long in so many people. The ordinary instruments miss it. The wall ages and softens again in a language most of our measurements never learn to read. Now I have been talking about the great pipe, the aorta, the main line out of the heart. But I do not want to leave you thinking the improvement lies only in the plumbing. It lives just as surely in the little factories. And this is where the story goes down into the deep small, into a place inside your muscles so tiny you will never feel it directly, and yet you have been running it your whole life without a thought. Inside every muscle fiber in your calf there are these small bodies, thousands upon thousands of them, and their job is to take the food you eat and the air you breathe and turn them, quietly, into the energy that lets the fiber pull. We call them the powerhouses, and that is not a poet's flourish, it is nearly a literal job description. They burn fuel with oxygen, and they make the little packets of usable energy the muscle spends on every contraction. And like the vein wall, and like the artery, they get slower and sleepier with age and with stillness. A muscle that is never asked to work stops keeping its factories in good repair. Here is what I find almost unreasonable, almost too generous to be true, and yet it has been measured carefully in real older people, not in a computer, not in a mouse. Take a group of older adults and have them do nothing more exotic than a set of calf raises. Stand, rise up on the toes, come down, rise again. That is the whole prescription. Now go inside the muscle and measure how hard the little factories are breathing, how briskly they are turning fuel and oxygen into energy. 15 minutes after that simple set, in healthy older adults, the respiration of those factories has climbed by about 35%. 15 minutes. Not 15 weeks. You lifted your heels a while ago, you sat down, and while you were sitting there, the factories inside your calf quietly turned up their output by better than a third. And by the following day, a full day later, certain measures of that respiration had climbed by something closer to 45%. The muscle did not just do the work and go back to sleep. It woke up, and it stayed more awake. And now let me tell you the part that moved me most when I turned it over, because it speaks to the people who need it worst. In that same careful study, they did not only look at healthy older folks. They also looked at people with poor circulation in the legs, the ones whose blood does not move as it should, the ones for whom a walk to the mailbox can ache. And when they measured the factories in those legs at the start, they found them badly underpowered. One of the main engines of the whole energy process, what they call complex 1, was running about 40% lower than in the healthy older people. 40% down before they even began. You might think, well, those factories are too far gone, the machinery is too damaged, a little exercise cannot possibly reach them. And you would be wrong. 1 hour after a single session in those very patients, the efficiency of the coupling, the tightness with which the factory turns its fuel into usable energy without waste, went up not by a third, not by half, but by 3.5-fold. 3.5 times better 1 hour after they finished. The most broken factories showed the most dramatic waking. It is as if the muscle had been waiting, all this time quietly starved, and the moment you asked it to do its ancient job, it flung open the doors and started running the lines it had forgotten it owned. And this was not a crowd of thousands, it was a small and honest study, only about 22 people all told, 11 with a poor circulation and 11 healthy, but it was measured directly, inside the tissue, not guessed at from the outside. So sit with the shape of this for a moment, because 2 clocks are now ticking backward at once, and they are ticking on completely different scales. Up in the great artery, over 8 to 16 weeks, the wall is softening and the wave is slowing, and years are quietly coming off. And down in the muscle, within 15 minutes to a day, the tiny factories are turning up their fires and burning cleaner. The big slow change and the small fast change are the same story told at 2 sizes. The whole living system, from the meter-long aorta down to the bodies too small to see, is listening for the same signal, and the signal is simply this: you moved. You asked me to work. And so I will repair myself, because that is what I am for. There is a thread running through everything I have laid before you tonight, and I want to name it plainly now, gently, before we go on to see it proven in real aching legs on a real treadmill. Every single piece of this machinery, the tall column of pressure and the little check valves that chop it short, the great reservoir in the calf and the muscles that squeezes it, the invisible molecule that keeps the walls supple and the small factories that fuel the squeeze, every last piece of it was built by a very long history of animals that walked. It was never designed to sit. It was designed for a body in motion across a landscape, hour after hour, day after day. The stillness we have arranged for ourselves, the chair and the desk and the long quiet evening on our feet at the sink, is the strange thing. It is the unnatural condition. And the machinery does not so much break from age as it goes slack from disuse, and then age finishes what the stillness began. Which is why the fix is so absurdly simple that people refuse to believe it can be the answer. They want it to be complicated. They want it to be a machine, a supplement, a procedure. And the whole marvelous apparatus is sitting there in the leg fully built, waiting, asking only to be used the way it was always meant to be used. So the last thing I want to do, before this evening is through, is take you into a room where they proved it, where they took people whose legs were genuinely swollen and genuinely sore and asked them to do almost the gentlest thing imaginable, and then measured, with water and with numbers, exactly what changed. And what they found is quiet and undramatic and completely convincing, and it is where we turn next. So come with me into that room. It is nothing special to look at. There is a treadmill, the ordinary kind, and there is a tank of water, and there are 21 women who have agreed to let themselves be measured. They range in age from 32 to 72, and if you took the average, it would land right around 49.5. Every one of them has legs that ache. Not in some vague, poetic way. In the specific, tired, swollen way we have been talking about all evening. Their veins have been graded on a clinical scale, and they fall into what the doctors call Class 2 and Class 3, which in plain speech means visible, twisted, enlarged veins and legs that swell as the day wears on. These are not athletes. These are people whose legs have gone slack in exactly the manner we described, and who feel it every evening at the sink, or on the bus, or climbing the last flight of stairs to bed. Now, before a single one of them takes a step, the researchers do something clever, and it is so simple that it delights me. They measure the size of the leg by dunking it in water. That is all. You put the leg into a tank filled to the brim, and the water that spills out is exactly the volume of the leg. This is the oldest trick in physics. It is the trick they tell you an old philosopher shouted about in his bath, running through the street, because he had suddenly understood that a body pushes aside its own volume of water and no more. 20-some centuries later, here it is again, being used to answer a question about tired legs. You cannot argue with displaced water. It does not care about your opinion. It does not care whether the patient feels better or worse. It simply tells you how much leg there is, down to the milliliter. And a swollen leg, a leg logged with stagnant fluid that the slack pump failed to move, will spill more water than a leg that has been properly drained. So they measure. They write the number down. Then they ask these women to do the gentlest imaginable thing. They put on a pair of compression stockings, the kind that squeeze the leg with a pressure somewhere between 20 and 30 millimeters of mercury, snug at the ankle and easing off higher up. And then they walk. Not a march, not a run. They walk on the treadmill at 3 kilometers per hour. Let me tell you how slow that is. 3 kilometers per hour is a stroll. It is the pace of someone window shopping, someone wandering through a garden with no particular place to be. A brisk walker does 5, 6, even 7 kilometers per hour. These women are ambling. And they amble for 50 minutes. That is the whole intervention. A slow walk, a little under an hour, with a firm stocking hugging the calf. And then they dunk the leg again. Here is what the water said. After that single slow walk, the volume of the leg had gone down. Measurably. The swelling had retreated. And this was not a fluke of one enthusiastic patient. When they ran the numbers across the whole group, the probability that this shrinkage happened by pure chance came out below 3 in 100. In the language of the people who do these studies, that is a real effect, not noise. The leg got smaller because the muscle pump, roused by 50 gentle minutes and helped along by the squeeze of the stocking, had done its job. It had reached down into those soleal reservoirs, those thin-walled sinuses loaded with pooled blood, and it had pushed the stagnant fluid up and out and back toward the heart, the way it was always meant to. The water in the tank was simply reporting without emotion that the second heart had started beating again. But they did not stop at the size of the leg, because a smaller leg is nice, and yet what a person actually feels is the ache. So they asked about the pain too, before and after, and they scored it. And the pain went down as well, and here the odds against chance were even steeper, below 7 in 1,000. Think about the ordinariness of what caused that relief. No drug, no needle, no operation. A slow walk. The legs hurt less because the pressure that had been sitting in them, that 90-millimeter column we spent so much of this evening building up in your mind, had been drained down and carried away, and the tissues that had been swollen tight were no longer straining. And there was one more thing they checked. Quieter still. They had some of these women simply wear the compression stockings through the whole ordinary day, going about their business, and then measured the leg in the evening, when swelling is always at its worst. And the evening swelling was reduced too, and this time the odds against it being an accident were smaller than 1 in 10,000. That is about as certain as this kind of study ever gets. The stocking, by gently opposing the outward push of the vein wall, kept the veins narrower, and narrower veins let the valves meet in the middle, and valves that meet do their job, and so the leg stayed drained through the very hours it would normally have filled. Now I want you to sit with how modest all of this is, because the modesty is the point. There was no miracle in that room. There was a slow walk, and a firm sock, and a tank of water. And yet the machinery responded exactly the way the physics said it would. That is the thing that gets me. You can predict it from first principles. You know the column is 90 millimeters of mercury when the leg is still. You know that walking collapses it below 25. You know the pump ejects better than 60% of the venous volume with each proper contraction. And so you know before anyone dunks a single leg that the water in that tank has to spill less afterward. The body is not being coaxed into some unnatural feat. It is being allowed at last to do the thing it was built for. And when you widen the lens beyond that one gentle trial, the numbers keep pointing the same direction. The people who study circulation in its more serious forms, the doctors who treat patients whose leg arteries are genuinely narrowed and starved, have settled on what they call the gold standard, and it is almost comically plain. It is walking. Sessions of about an hour 3 times in a week, kept up for at least 12 weeks. That is the prescription. Not a device, not a clinic full of machines. A person, a pair of shoes, and the patience to keep walking for 3 months. And the body, given that steady, repeated demand, responds the way a well-run business responds to steady orders. It widens the roads it already has. And then, remarkably, it builds new ones. It grows fresh little vessels, collateral channels, detours around the crowded and the narrowed places, so that blood can reach the tissue by routes that did not exist before the walking began. The engineers of your own circulation lay new pipe, quietly, in response to nothing more than being asked to move blood again and again. And behind all of it stands the largest and simplest number of the whole evening, the one that ought to be printed over every doorway. People who move regularly, who keep this machinery in use, lower their risk of dying across all the causes lumped together by something like 20 to 35%. And in some of the studies the figure runs higher still, up toward 1/2. Let that land gently. There is no pill that does that. There is no supplement on any shelf that does that. There is a walk. The most ancient, unremarkable human thing there is. Heel, then toe. The same motion your grandmother used, and hers, and every upright creature back along the line to the first ones who stood up on 2 legs and found that the ground kept coming toward them if they leaned into it. So think again about that person we started with, standing dead still on the kitchen floor at the end of a long day, feet aching, ankles thick, the whole tall column of pressure fully loaded and pressing down. Nothing is wrong with that person. The machine is intact. The valves are seated in their little sinuses. The soleus is packed with its thousands of veins and its reservoirs of waiting blood. The endothelium lines every vessel ready to feel the rush of flow and answer it. It is all there. It is simply, at that moment, switched off. And everything we have spent this evening taking apart, the hydrostatics, the check valves, the second heart, the suction of the swinging foot, the invisible molecule that keeps the walls supple, the little factories in the muscle waking within a quarter of an hour, all of it is waiting on one thing and one thing only. The next step, and what I find myself wanting to understand now, as the evening draws toward its quiet close, is what actually happens in the very first seconds after that step is finally taken, when the whole loaded column, all 90 millimeters of it, begins to fall. So let us fall with it. Let us stand very close to that first step and slow it down until we can see the seconds unfold one at a time, the way you might slow down the pouring of syrup to watch it fold over itself. The heel lifts. The soleus and its broad partner behind the shin begin to shorten, and they press inward on the deep sinuses, those thin-walled reservoirs stuffed with waiting blood. And in that instant the pressure inside those veins does not drift down, it leaps up. For a fraction of a second the muscle squeezes the blood to a peak that can reach something like 140 millimeters of mercury, higher than the resting column ever was, and that is exactly what you want, because that surge is what slams the blood upward past the nearest valve. Now watch what the valve does, because this is the loveliest part. The blood rushes up through it, and the 2 little leaflets are pinned flat against the wall by the flood going the right way. They offer no resistance at all to blood traveling toward the heart. Then the muscle relaxes. The squeeze lets go, and for a moment the blood that was just launched upward hesitates, feels the old pull of gravity, and starts, ever so slightly, to sag back down. That backward sag is what the valve is built for. The reversing blood catches under the 2 leaflets like wind filling a sail, and they swing shut, and they meet in the middle, and they hold. Somewhere between half a second and a full second after the muscle lets go, that door is closed, and the blood above it is now trapped up there. It cannot come back down. It has been handed off to the next chamber, and the next valve up the line is already waiting to receive it. Think about what that means for the tall column we were so worried about. Before the step, the pressure at the ankle was the full weight of blood stacked all the way from the foot to the chest. One continuous unbroken pillar, and that pillar pressed on the ankle with its 90 millimeters. But the moment the valves start closing, that single tall pillar is chopped into pieces. There is no longer one column reaching from your foot to your heart. There is a little segment from your foot to the first closed valve. Then a separate segment resting on that closed door. Then another above it. Each segment is short. And because the pressure at the bottom of a column depends only on the height of the column above it, a short segment presses only lightly. You have taken a tower and turned it into a staircase, and no single stair is very tall. That is the whole trick. That is how the 90 comes down to less than 25 within a few strides. Not by magic, not by some chemical, but by breaking a tall thing into short things. And here is a detail I skipped over that I do not want you to miss, because it happens in the same breath. While the calf behind is squeezing blood upward, the muscle in front of the shin, the anterior tibial muscle, is doing something almost sneaky during the part of the step where the foot is swinging forward through the air. As it contracts and the vein bed under it opens, it does not push, it pulls. It creates a gentle suction, a low place, a region where the pressure dips down toward nothing at all. And blood from the shallow veins near the skin, the superficial system, feels that low place and slides sideways into it, through the little connecting veins that pierce the muscle wall, the perforators. So one part of your leg is pushing blood up and out, and another part at the very same time is quietly drawing blood in from the surface and tucking it into the deep channels where the pump can grab it on the next stroke. Pushing and pulling, squeezing and drawing, all folded into a single ordinary step you would never look at twice. This is why, when the careful people measured it, walking beat standing calf raises. You would think lifting up onto your toes over and over would be the purest way to work the calf pump, and it does work it. But when they watched the pressure in the great saphenous vein, the long superficial vein that runs up the inside of the leg, they found that during those isolated heel raises, the time average pressure sat about 1/2 higher than it did during walking at the same rhythm. Half again as much pressure lingering in the vein. Why? Because the heel raise is only half the machine. It gives you the squeeze of the back of the calf, but it leaves out the swing, and the swing is where the front of the shin does its suction. Walking uses both halves. The push and the pull work as a matched pair, and the pair is far better than either piece alone. Nature did not design you to stand in one place lifting your heels. It designed you to travel across the ground, and the whole elegant business only runs at full efficiency when you are actually going somewhere. Let me linger on the rhythm of it, because the numbers here are almost startling once you sit with them. The blood flow through the leg does not rise gently and evenly as you walk faster. It climbs in a curve that bends upward, the kind of curve that starts slow and then runs away with itself. When the careful people fit a formula to what they saw, the flow went roughly as a starting amount multiplied by a number that grows exponentially with how many steps you take each minute. In plain speech, that means the difference between a slow shuffle and a brisk walk is not a small difference in how hard the pump works. It is a large one, and it grows larger the faster you go. Somewhere in the range of 75 to 90 steps a minute, a steady, purposeful walk, the pressure inside the muscle veins is driven down until it hovers near zero. Near zero. The blood is being handed upwards so efficiently that there is almost no pressure left down in the working muscle at all. And both halves of the pump, the ejection that shoves blood out and the suction that draws it in, climb along that same steepening curve, marching in near perfect step with the leg's demand for flow. That is worth pausing on. When you walk faster, your muscles need more blood, more oxygen, more of everything. And the very act of walking faster is what supplies it, because the pump that delivers the blood is driven by the same motion that created the need. The demand and the supply are welded to each other by the mechanics of the stride. There is no separate messenger who has to run to the heart and ask for more. The asking and the giving are the same event. I find that a beautiful piece of engineering, the sort of thing that if a person had designed it on purpose, you would call clever, and since nobody designed it, you can only call it lucky and old and true. Now hold that picture of near zero pressure in the moving muscle against the picture we started with. The still person at the end of the day with 90 pressing on the ankle. The gap between those two states is enormous, and the bridge between them is nothing more than motion. Not medicine, not surgery, not some exotic machine. Just the ordinary rocking of weight from heel to toe, over and over, the oldest movement your body knows. Everything the vascular surgeon measures with his fine instruments, the ambulatory venous pressure falling below 25, the ejection fraction of better than 60% of the vein's volume flung upward on a single contraction, the roughly 1/5 of a milliliter of blood squeezed out of a hand's length of calf vein each cycle, 4 times what trickles through at rest, all of it is just the visible shadow of that plane motion made countable. And there is one more number in this story that tells you whether the valves are doing their job, and I love it, because it is a test you could almost feel yourself. When you stop walking and stand still again, the pressure down at the ankle does not snap back to 90 all at once. It has to climb back up, refilling the column from above through the slow trickle of the arteries, and if the valves are competent, if those little doors are all holding tight, that climb takes a good long while. More than 20 seconds to come back up to the standing value. That slowness is health. It means the staircase of closed valves is holding the blood in its separate short segments, and gravity has to work patiently against every one of them. But in a leg where the valves have failed, where the leaflets no longer meet in the middle, the pressure comes rushing back in far less than 20 seconds, because the blood simply pours back down through the doors that will not close, refilling the whole tall column in a hurry. The refilling time is the confession. A leg that recovers slowly is a leg whose pump is intact. A leg that recovers fast is a leg quietly telling you its valves have given way. So you see we have arrived, without quite announcing it, at the difference between a system that works and a system that has begun to fail. And the difference lives entirely in those small patient doors and the muscle that drives them. Which makes me want to turn now, gently, to the question of what it actually feels like from the inside when the doors start to leak. And how a thing so mechanical, so much a matter of pressure and height and one-way flow, ends up being felt by a person simply as a heaviness in the legs they blame on the passing years. Picture the ordinary complaint. A person comes in and says their legs feel heavy at the end of the day. Not painful exactly, not sharp, just heavy, as though someone had quietly filled their shoes with wet sand while they weren't looking. By morning it has gone. By evening it returns. And almost everyone who has this tells you the same thing, in almost the same words. They say, "Well, I suppose I'm getting older." They hand the whole business over to time as if time were the culprit, when really time is only the stage on which the mechanical story plays out. Because what they are feeling, that heaviness, is not a vague thing at all. It is water. It is fluid that has left the blood and gone to sit in the tissues of the leg, and it went there because the pressure in those small veins stayed high all day instead of dropping the way it should. Let me make that leaking feeling concrete, because it is such a beautiful and simple piece of plumbing once you see it. Inside the smallest vessels, the capillaries, there is a constant, quiet negotiation going on between two forces. One force is the blood pressure inside the vessel, pushing fluid outward, out through the thin wall into the surrounding tissue. The other force pulls fluid back in, held by the proteins dissolved in the blood, which act a little like salt in a sponge, coaxing water toward themselves. In a healthy leg, these two forces are nearly balanced across the whole length of the day. A little fluid leaks out at one end, a little gets drawn back at the other, and the small excess is carried away by the lymph vessels like a drain quietly doing its job in the corner of the room. The books stay balanced. Now raise the pressure in the veins and hold it there. Remember our column, that tall unbroken stack of blood reaching from the ankle to the heart, pressing down at something near 90 millimeters of mercury when a person stands and does not move. In a good leg, the muscle pump keeps knocking that number down again and again every few steps, so the little capillaries downstream never feel the full weight for long. But in a leg where the valves have started to leak, the pump gives its push and the blood simply slides back down through the doors that will not shut, and the pressure climbs back up in seconds. So the capillaries live hour after hour with the outward push turned up too high. More fluid leaves than returns. The drain in the corner, the lymphatics, works harder and finally cannot keep pace. And the excess collects in the tissue of the ankle and the calf, and that is the wet sand in the shoes. That is the heaviness. It has a cause you can measure, and the cause is a pressure that never got to rest. I find it a little marvelous and a little sad that such a precise mechanical failure gets filed under the word old. Because if you press a fingertip into a swollen ankle at the end of one of these days and lift it away, you will sometimes see a small dent stay behind for a moment before it slowly fills back in. That little dent is the fluid that does not belong there, moving reluctantly aside and then creeping back. It is a physical readout of a pressure problem sitting right there under your thumb, and it has almost nothing to do with the number of years the person has lived, and almost everything to do with whether those valves are meeting in the middle and whether that calf is being asked to move. And here is the part that I think most people never get told. The swelling is not the end of the story. It is the middle of the story, and if the pressure stays high long enough, the story keeps going into places you would not expect. When the veins in the leg run at high pressure for months and years, the smallest vessels begin to change. Their walls, meant to be thin and delicate for the easy exchange of fluid, become leakier still, and they let out not just water now, but larger things. Red blood cells that wander out into the tissue and break down and leave behind a rusty brown stain in the skin around the ankle. You have surely seen it, that darkening low on the leg in an older person, and perhaps like everyone else you thought it was just the color of age. It is not. It is iron, from blood that leaked where it should not have, painting the skin from underneath. It is the pressure writing its history in pigment. Follow the pressure a little further, and the skin itself begins to suffer. Tissue that sits in swollen, high-pressure surroundings does not get fed as cleanly. The oxygen and the nutrients have to cross a wider, wetter, more congested gap to reach the cells that need them, and the waste has a harder time getting carried away. The skin grows tight, sometimes hardened, sometimes itchy and inflamed, and in the worst and most stubborn cases it can break down into an open sore that will not heal, low on the inside of the ankle, exactly where the pressure is greatest and the column is tallest. And recall the number from earlier in our talk, that roughly 4 out of every 100 people past the age of 65 will develop one of these venous ulcers. That is not a rare curiosity. That is a common ending to a story that began, years before, with nothing more than a little heaviness in the legs at night that somebody decided was just getting older. I want to be careful and fair here, the way I always try to be, because I do not want to frighten anyone lying quietly listening to this. Not every heavy leg is on the road to an ulcer. Most are not. The body has enormous reserves, and the lymphatic drain and the healthy segments of vein carry a great deal of the burden for a very long time. But I want you to see the through line, the single thread that connects the smallest evening swelling to the most serious skin breakdown. Because it is all one thing. It is all pressure. It is all the failure of that tall column to be broken into short, gentle, harmless segments the way nature intended. Every symptom on that road, the heaviness, the brown stain, the hardened skin, the sore that will not close, is the same physical fact seen at a later hour. Pressure that should have been knocked down and was not. Now think about what that means turned the other way around. If the whole cascade begins with a pressure that stays too high because the muscle is not moving and the valves are leaking, then the single most powerful thing you can do at any point along that road is to knock the pressure back down. Not with a drug, not with a knife, though those have their places. With the pump, with the muscle, with the plain act of moving the calf and letting the doors do their work between the pushes. And the astonishing thing, which we are building toward and will lay out carefully, is that the pump responds even in a leg that has been neglected for decades. The soleus is still there, holding its reservoir of blood in those thin-walled sinuses. The valves that remain competent still close in their half a second to a second. The moment you ask the leg to walk, the pressure in the foot begins to fall from that resting 90 millimeters of mercury towards something under 25, and the capillaries downstream get their first real rest of the day, and the outward leak slows, and the drain in the corner finally catches up. There is a small experiment you can almost feel in your own body, and it tells the whole tale in a single afternoon. A person with heavy swollen legs sits still at a desk through the morning, and by noon the ankles are thick and the shoes feel tight. That is the pressure holding steady and the fluid gathering. Then that same person gets up and walks for half an hour, an unremarkable walk, nothing athletic, and by the time they sit back down, the ankles are perceptibly slimmer and the legs feel lighter. And the change is not imagination. It is fluid that was pressed back out of the tissue and returned to the circulation. Because for 30 minutes the muscle pump was breaking the column and dropping the pressure, and the balance in the capillaries tipped back the other way. The books that had gone into the red went, for a while, back into the black. And every step contributed. Every heel lift squeezed the soleal sinusoids and sent their blood upward. Every swing of the foot let the anterior muscle draw a little more from the shallow veins into the deep ones. The relief you can feel with your own two hands is the sum of thousands of these tiny, unglamorous pumps, each one no more dramatic than lifting a heel off the floor. So the heaviness that a person blames on the years is really an invitation, if only they knew how to read it. It is the leg saying, quietly, that the pump has gone idle and the column has gone tall and the pressure has nowhere to hide. And the answer is written in the same language as the complaint. It is mechanical. It is pressure and height and one-way flow, and it bends to motion the way it bends to nothing else. Which brings me to the molecule I have been keeping in my pocket this whole time, the tiny invisible thing the moving blood tickles out of the vessel wall itself. A molecule so small and so short-lived that for most of the history of medicine nobody even suspected it was there. And yet it may be the quiet hinge on which the youth of your whole circulation turns. Let me tell you about this molecule, because it is one of the strangest characters in the whole story. It is nitric oxide. One atom of nitrogen, one atom of oxygen stuck together in the simplest possible partnership. It is a gas. It is the kind of thing you would expect to find leaking out of a tailpipe, not running your circulation, and it lives, once it is made, for only a second or two before it falls apart. For most of the history of medicine, nobody imagined that something so fleeting, so plain, could be doing anything at all inside you. And yet here it is, made fresh, moment by moment, by the thin lining of every one of your blood vessels, and it is one of the main reasons a young vessel stays soft and open and a neglected one goes stiff. Picture, if you would, a single cell on the inside wall of a small artery deep in your calf. It is a flat little tile, one of millions, paving the inner surface of the tube. We call that pavement the endothelium. Now that little cell spends its whole life with blood sliding over it. Not pressing straight down, mind you, but dragging sideways, the way a river drags along its own bed. That sideways drag has a name. We call it shear stress. And this is the lovely part. The cell can feel it. The faster and smoother the blood slides over it, the more that little tile is stroked in one steady direction, and something in it responds. It switches on a small molecular machine, an enzyme with a long name we can shorten to eNOS, and that machine begins turning out nitric oxide, puff after puff, straight into the wall of the vessel. And what does the nitric oxide do? It tells the muscle wrapped around that artery to relax, to let go. The vessel widens, softens, opens its throat a little more, and the blood flows easier. So you see the beautiful loop of it. Moving blood strokes the wall. The stroked wall makes the gas. The gas widens the tube. The wider tube carries more blood. Motion, in other words, teaches your arteries to open themselves. It is a conversation between the fluid and the pipe, and the currency of that conversation is this one tiny, disappearing molecule. Now here is the sorrow of getting older, told honestly. That machinery runs down. As the years accumulate, the little tile makes less nitric oxide, and what it does make gets snatched away before it can do its job. There are troublemakers in the aging vessel, restless fragments of oxygen we call reactive oxygen species, and they pounce on the nitric oxide and destroy it almost the instant it appears. So even where the gas is being made, it does not survive to deliver its message. The vessel stops hearing the instruction to stay soft. It drifts, slowly, towards stiffness. And a stiff pipe is an old pipe, whatever the calendar happens to say. But watch what motion does to this decline, because it is genuinely one of the most hopeful things I know in all of physiology. When you walk, when you move that blood faster and keep it flowing smooth and steady, you crank up the shear stress on all those little tiles at once. You are, in the most literal way, stroking your vessels from the inside. And that steady stroking does two gifts in one. It coaxes the eNOS machinery back to work so more nitric oxide gets made. And it quiets the troublemakers, so that less of the gas gets destroyed before it can act. You are turning up the supply and turning down the theft, both at the same time, simply by moving. We can even watch this in the numbers, and I do love it when a thing so invisible leaves a fingerprint we can weigh. In one careful trial that ran a full 12 months, the people who exercised and the people who sat still were both measured for a particular chemical marker of that oxygen damage, a little wreckage molecule with the name F2-isoprostane. Think of it as soot. The more of it you find, the more burning has been going on inside the vessel wall. And over the year, in the ones who kept moving, the soot went down. In the ones who stayed sedentary, it went up. Same year, same clock ticking for both groups, and yet the machinery aged in one direction for the movers and the opposite direction for the sitters. The vessel, it turns out, is not simply a victim of time. It is listening to what you ask of it. Now I want to give you a number that measures the age of your arteries directly, because I think it is one of the most quietly astonishing measurements in the body. Every time your heart beats, it does not just push blood, it sends a wave, a pressure pulse racing down the aorta and out into the great vessels, the same way a wave runs down a rope when you snap one end of it. And here is the thing about waves on a rope. Their speed depends on the rope. A soft, floppy rope carries the wave slowly. A tight, stiff rope carries it fast. Snap a loose clothesline and the wave ambles along. Snap a taut steel cable and it cracks down the length almost at once. Your arteries are that rope. A young artery is soft and springy, and the pressure wave rolls down it at a leisurely pace. An old, stiffened artery is the taut cable, and the wave whips along much faster. So if you simply measure how fast that pulse travels from one point in the body to another, you get a direct reading of how stiff the great vessels have become. We call that measurement the pulse wave velocity. Pulse wave velocity. It is near enough a speedometer for aging. The faster your pulse wave runs, the older your arteries are behaving, no matter what year you were born. And now the payoff, the thing I have been walking you toward. When people take up steady aerobic movement, the sort of thing that a good long walk provides, and they keep at it for something like 8 to 16 weeks, that pulse wave velocity comes down. It slows. The rope softens. The measured drop is somewhere in the range of 0.5 meter per second to 1.5 meters per second. Now that may not sound like much, a fraction of the speed of a walking pace. But translate it into years and you sit up straight. A drop of that size corresponds to peeling somewhere between 5 and 15 years off the stiffness of your arteries. 5 to 15 years, undone, not by any pill, not by any surgery, but by asking your vessels week after week to carry moving blood. And this is not a cosmetic number, not merely a nicer figure to have on a chart. It reaches all the way down to whether you live or die. When you knock the pulse wave velocity down by even a modest amount, something like 0.5 meter to 0.75 meters per second, the risk of cardiovascular disease falls with it, by something on the order of 6 to 10%. The softness of the rope and the length of the life are tied together. One trial with middle-aged men found that in just 3 months of consistent training their arterial springiness measurably improved, and here is the detail I find so telling, it improved without their blood pressure at rest changing at all. The number on the cuff sat still, but the vessel underneath it had quietly grown younger. The cuff was not fine enough to see it. The pulse wave was. So think of what you have now, stacked one atop the other. Down at the foot, the tall column of pressure, 90 millimeters of mercury of pure gravity, waiting in the still leg. The one-way valves that chop that column into harmless little segments the moment you move. The soleus, that silent second heart, squeezing its hidden reservoir of blood upward on every step. The suction of the shin muscle drawing blood inward as the foot swings through the air. And now, threaded through all of it, this invisible gas, made by the stroking of moving blood, keeping the pipes themselves soft and willing. Every layer of it, from the crude hydraulics of the column to the delicate chemistry of a molecule that lives 2 seconds, every single layer answers to the same simple request. Move, move, and the whole apparatus wakes and tends itself. But I have not yet told you the deepest layer of all, the smallest room in the whole house. Because underneath the vessels and the valves and the gas, down inside the muscle fibers themselves, there are the little engines that make the whole thing possible. The tiny power plants we call mitochondria. Thousands upon thousands of them in every fiber, burning fuel with oxygen to make the energy that lets a muscle contract at all. And as we age, these little engines, like everything else we have met tonight, run slower and dirtier and less willing. You would think it would take months of dedication to stir them. You would think a single afternoon could not possibly matter to something so deep. And you would be, as we are about to see, quite wonderfully wrong. Let me take you all the way down into that smallest room now, and let me tell you exactly what somebody found when they went looking. They gathered a small group of people, 22 in all. 11 of them were older folks with a circulation problem in the legs, the kind we have been circling all evening, and 11 of them were their healthy peers, similar in years but sound of vessel. And they did not ask these people to run marathons. They did not put them through weeks of boot camp. They asked them to do something almost comically modest, to rise up on the balls of the feet and come back down. Calf raises. The same little motion your body performs by accident 100 times a day when you reach for a high shelf. And then the scientists went into the muscle, took the tiniest sample of it, and measured how hard the little engines inside were breathing. Here is what they saw in the healthy older people. 15 minutes. That is all. 15 minutes after the last calf raise, the respiration of the mitochondria, the very rate at which those engines were consuming oxygen and turning it into usable energy, had climbed by roughly 35%. Think about the smallness of the cause and the size of the effect. A few minutes of a gentle up and down motion, and a third more life in the deepest furnaces of the muscle already before the person had even caught their breath properly. And it did not stop there. By 24 hours later, a full day on, certain measures of that respiration had risen by something like 45%. So the body was not just flaring up and settling back down. It was reading the message and rebuilding around it, quietly through the night while the person slept. Now hold that in your mind, because the next part is the part I find almost tender. The 11 people with the diseased circulation, the ones whose legs had been failing them, started from a poorer place. Their mitochondria, at the deepest level, the part of the machinery called complex 1, the very first handoff in the long chain of energy production, was running about 40% weaker than in their healthy companions, 40% down before they lifted a heel. You might expect that a body in that condition would be too far gone to respond, that the engines were too worn to answer a knock, and that is exactly the assumption I want you to feel crumble. Because when those same struggling people did the same modest calf raises, 1 hour afterward, the efficiency with which their mitochondria coupled their breathing to actual energy production, the tightness of the whole arrangement, the amount of useful work squeezed from each breath of oxygen had jumped by 3.5 times. Not 3.5%, 3.5 times over. The weakest engines in the room made the biggest leap. The body that had the most to gain, gained the most, and it gained it fastest. There is something almost unfair about it, in the kindest possible direction. The system that has been neglected the longest is often the one that responds most gratefully to the first bit of attention. I want you to sit with why that should be so, because it is not magic, it is signaling. A mitochondrion does not know it is old. It does not carry a calendar. It responds to demand, to the local weather of the cell around it. When a muscle contracts and burns through its little store of energy, the byproducts of that burning pile up. The spent fuel, the change in the chemical balance, the tug of low energy, all of it acts as a set of instructions. It tells the cell, we are being asked to do more than we can currently do, so build more capacity. Make more engines. Make the ones we have run cleaner and tighter. The signal to grow does not come from being young. It comes from being used. And a body that has been sitting still for years is a body that has heard no such signal in a very long time, so the first true one lands like rain on a cracked field. And here is a thing worth pausing on, gently in the dark. All evening we have been building a tower. Down at the bottom, the crudest layer, the sheer physical weight of a tall column of liquid pressing down on the ankle, that raw 90 millimeters of mercury that is nobody's fault, only geometry and gravity. Then a floor up, the clever valves, the little swinging doors that chop that heavy column into a stack of light ones. Above them, the great soft muscle of the calf, the second heart, squeezing the deep reservoirs empty with every step. Above that, the invisible chemistry, the ghost of a molecule that dilates the vessels and tells the walls to keep themselves in repair. And now, at the very top, in the smallest room of all, the engines that make every one of those lower floors possible in the first place, because a muscle with dead mitochondria cannot squeeze, and a vessel wall with no energy cannot maintain itself. It all rests on the little furnaces. And the little furnaces, it turns out, answer to the same single word every other floor answers to: move. That is the quiet astonishment I keep returning to. One instruction given to the whole tower at once. You do not have to write a separate letter to the valves, and another to the muscle, and another to the chemistry, and another to the mitochondria. You do not have to understand any of it. You do not have to know your soleus from your shoulder blade. You simply move the legs, and every floor of the building reads its own copy of the same message in its own language and does its own work. The hydraulics drop their pressure. The valves get their rest between beats. The muscle empties its sinuses. The endothelium feels the rush of blood sliding along it and wakes its chemistry. And down in the basement of the cell, the engines take a full day and a night to quietly multiply. One motion. A whole house tending itself. Now let me be honest with you about the size of this, because I do not want to oversell it, and I do not need to. Nobody is claiming a set of calf raises makes a person 20 again. What the measurements show is more modest, and I think more believable, which is why I trust it. A single session stirs the engines for a day. That is real, and it was measured directly, in tissue, not guessed at. But a single session is a single stone. The building of the thing, the real reversal, comes from laying stone after stone, day after day, until the body stops treating the demand as a surprise and starts treating it as the new normal it must be built for. The single session proves the machinery can still hear. The repetition is what convinces it to stay changed. And think about what that means for the person who believes it is too late. The person who looks down at heavy, tired legs and files the feeling under the word old and closes the drawer. The measurements say the drawer is not locked. The measurements say the most damaged engines in that room of 22 people made the largest leap of anyone within a single hour after the gentlest possible effort. Whatever else you take from tonight, take that. The responsiveness does not vanish with age. It hides. It goes quiet because nothing has asked anything of it. But it is still there, waiting, and it answers faster than anyone has any right to expect. There is a lovely symmetry, too, in where the engines live and what they serve. The mitochondria that leap the highest are packed into the very calf muscle we have been calling the second heart all night. So when you rise onto the balls of your feet, you are not doing two separate favors, one for the pump and one for the power plant. You are doing a single thing that serves both at once. The contraction that squeezes the deep venous sinuses and shoves that little spoonful of blood up toward the chest is the very same contraction that burns the fuel that signals the engines to multiply. The pump and the furnace are the same muscle. You cannot exercise one without exercising the other. Nature bundled them together and handed them to you as a single unit, and all it asks in return is that you use the unit for its intended purpose, which is to move you across the ground. So the picture is nearly complete now. We have the weight of the standing column, we have the doors that tame it, we have the muscle that pumps against it, we have the molecule that keeps the vessel supple, and now we have the engines, deep and small and thought to be beyond reach, proving they will wake within a quarter of an hour and rebuild themselves overnight. 5 floors of a single building, each with its own trick, each degrading in its own slow way with the years, and every one of them, from the crude bottom to the subtle top, answering the same soft knock. But there is one more thing I owe you before we are done. I have shown you the machinery in pieces floor by floor, the way you take apart a clock to see how it ticks. I have not yet put the whole clock back together and let it run, out in the world, in a real body, on a real afternoon, and shown you what somebody actually measured when they did. Let me do that now. Picture a room with a treadmill in it and a plain white basin of water off to one side and 21 women who have come in because their legs hurt. They are not athletes. They are not sick in any dramatic way. They range in age from 32 to 72, and if you took the average, you would land right around 49 and a half, which is to say the middle of a life. Every one of them has legs that ache and swell by evening, the kind of legs a doctor files under a label that sounds like a serial number, class 2 and class 3 of a skull called by 4 letters, but which the women themselves would describe with a single tired word: heavy. Their legs feel heavy. And somebody had the sense to ask a simple question. If the whole story I have been telling you is true, if walking really does collapse that tall column of pressure and squeeze the deep sinuses empty, then it ought to leave a mark you can weigh. Not a feeling, a number. So let us go get the number. Here is what they did, and I want you to notice how modest it is. They did not send these women to run. They set the treadmill to 3 kilometers an hour. That is slow. That is slower than you walk to answer a knock at the door. That is a stroll, an amble, the pace of somebody looking in shop windows with no particular place to be. And they had each woman walk at that gentle pace for 50 minutes wearing a snug elastic stocking on the leg, the kind that presses inward with a pressure somewhere between 20 and 30 of those same little millimeters of mercury we have been measuring all along. That is the whole treatment. A slow walk, most of an hour, in a firm sock. There is nothing in that prescription a child could not follow. Now for the weighing, and this is my favorite part because it is so beautifully crude. How do you measure the volume of a leg? You would think you need some clever scanner, some expensive machine that hums. No. You do what Archimedes did in his bath more than 2,000 years ago. You fill a container with water up to a line, and you lower the leg into it, and you catch the water that spills over the edge, and you measure that. The leg pushes aside exactly its own volume of water, and the water does not lie, and it does not care how anybody feels. Water displacement volumetry, they call it, which is a very grand name for a bucket and an overflow and an honest measurement. They dunked each leg before the walk, and they dunked it after, and they compared, and the legs got smaller. Measurably, and by the cold arithmetic of statistics, unmistakably smaller. The chance that this shrinkage was a fluke of the day, a coincidence of the weather, came out to less than 3 in 100. In the language of people who make their living being skeptical, that is a result you are allowed to believe. 50 minutes of a slow stroll, and the swelling that had settled into these legs was driven back out. The water in the basin proved it. The column had been erased, the sinuses squeezed, the fluid that had pulled by gravity carried back up toward the heart the way I have been promising you all along, and the leg that came out of the bath displaced less water than the leg that went in. But they measured a second thing, and this one you cannot put in a bucket, and yet it matters more to the woman living inside the leg. They measured the pain. And the pain went down too, and it went down hard. The odds against that being an accident came out to less than 7 in 1,000. Think about what that means for a moment, quietly. The heaviness that these women had been carrying for years, the ache they had very likely been told, was simply the toll of getting older, the thing to be endured and not questioned. That heaviness lifted after a single slow walk. Not a cure, not forever. The pressure would climb again the next time they stood still too long. But the direction of the thing had reversed. The leg had been getting worse for years, one slow degree at a time, and in 50 minutes it got better. And the getting better was real enough to spill less water and quiet a nerve. They looked at one more thing, and it stretched the picture out from a single afternoon into the whole shape of a day. What if, instead of one deliberate walk, the woman simply wore that firm stocking from morning until night, going about her ordinary business? And when they measured the legs in the evening, the swelling that normally arrives with the end of the day had been held back, and held back so consistently that the odds against it being chance fell below 1 in 10,000. So the pump answers a hard 50-minute dose, and it also answers the gentle all-day help of a sock that keeps the veins from ballooning outward. 2 different sizes of the same intervention, both writing their result in water and in the quieting of pain. Now I have shown you one careful little study with 21 women in it, And one study is one study, and I would be the first to poke it. So let me hand you the larger frame that the heart doctors have settled on, because they have run this experiment on many more people over much more time in the harder case of legs whose arteries are actually failing to deliver blood. Their considered recommendation, the thing they will tell a patient whose walking is limited by real disease in the arteries, is almost comically plain. Walk for an hour. Do it 3 times a week. Keep it up for at least 12 weeks, 3 months, a season of the year. That is the gold standard, the best prescription the field has to offer for a circulation that is failing, and it is not a pill and it is not a knife. It is an hour of walking, repeated with patience. And when a body is asked to do that, week after week, something happens that I find genuinely moving, because it shows you how deep the answer to the knock really goes. The body does not merely pump harder through the pipes it already has. It builds new pipes. Faced with the steady demand of a leg that keeps asking for more blood, the tissue widens the vessels that are there, and then it grows fresh ones alongside them. Little detour roads around the places where the traffic is bad. The doctors have long names for this, one word for the sprouting of brand new vessels and another for the widening of existing ones into major thoroughfares, but the plain fact underneath the names is that a walked upon body replumbs itself. It reads the repeated demand as an instruction, and it lays new pipe to meet it. You cannot buy that. You can only earn it, 1 hour at a time. And here, at the far end of all these numbers, sits the largest number of all, the one that ought to stop you in your tracks if any of them do. When you gather up all the studies, all the populations, all the years of watching who lives and who does not, the people who move their bodies regularly turn out to die less. Their risk of death, measured against the people who sit still, drops by something like 1/5 to 1/3, and in some of the studies by as much as 1/2. Now I want to be careful and honest with you, the way I have tried to be all night, because that is a big soft number stitched together from many kinds of movement and many kinds of people, and it is not a promise made to any one person about any one evening. But the direction of it is not in doubt. The thing your legs were built to do, the slow rhythmic emptying of the second heart down in your calf, is tangled up in the deepest way with how long the whole machine keeps running. So let me set the reassembled clock going and watch it tick, out in the world, in a real body, on that real afternoon we started with. A woman with heavy legs steps onto a slow treadmill. The first heel lifts. Down in the calf, the soleus with its thousands of veins and its great thin-walled reservoirs squeezes shut, and 1/2 milliliters of pooled blood is driven upward. The little bicuspid doors above the squeeze swing open to let it pass, and then, within a second of the muscle letting go, they fall shut behind it. And the tall 90-millimeter column that had been pressing on her ankle is chopped into a stack of short, harmless segments. As the foot swings forward through the air, the muscle along the front of her shin tightens and pulls a soft suction on the superficial veins, drawing blood inward and sideways into the deep channels so that the pressure in there sinks toward nothing at all. The next heel lifts. It happens again and again. 60, 70, 80 times a minute, the whole apparatus cycling, the pressure at her ankle already falling from 90 toward 25 and below, the swelling already beginning to retreat into the veins and away toward her chest. And that is only the fast part, the part you could watch on a pressure gauge inside the hour. The slow part has begun too, invisibly, and it will keep going long after she steps off the belt. On the inner walls of her small arteries, the moving blood is dragging its gentle shear across the endothelium, and those cells are answering by making more of that fleeting molecule of nitrogen and oxygen that tells the vessel to relax and to tend itself. Down inside the muscle fibers, the tiny engines are already stirring, and within 1/4 of an hour their capacity to burn fuel will have climbed by better than 1/3, and by tomorrow, while she sleeps, they will have built themselves further still. None of it announces itself. She only knows that her legs feel lighter walking out than they did walking in. But every floor of the building we took apart tonight is lit now. From the crude hydrostatic bottom to the molecular top, all of it running at once, all of it set in motion by nothing grander than one foot placed in front of the other. Let me sit with that lightness for a moment, because it hides a piece of engineering so quiet that almost nobody ever thinks to ask about it. When she walked out of that building feeling lighter, something had physically left her legs. It was water. Not much, a matter of a few spoonfuls perhaps, but enough to change the shape of an ankle, and there is a whole story in where that water went and why it had been there in the first place. You see, when the pressure in those foot veins sits up around 90 millimeters of mercury hour after hour, that pressure does not stay politely inside the plumbing. It pushes. It leans on the thin walls of the smallest vessels, the capillaries, where the blood and the tissue are separated by almost nothing at all, by a membrane you could not see without a very good microscope. And under that steady leaning, fluid seeps out of the vessels and into the spaces between the cells. That is what swelling is. It is not the blood pooling, exactly. It is the watery part of the blood being squeezed out through the walls, drop by drop, over the course of a long standing day, into the meat of the leg, where it sits and makes everything feel thick and tight and heavy. Now think about what happens the moment the pressure comes down. When she walks and the calf pump drops that column from 90 down under 25, the leaning stops. The capillary walls are no longer being pushed so hard, and the balance reverses. There is another pressure at work in there, a gentle pull that the proteins in the blood exert, always trying to draw water back inward, and once the mechanical shoving eases, that quiet pull wins. Water flows back into the vessels, the tissue gives up its extra fluid. And there is a second road out as well, a set of vessels most people have never once considered, the lymphatics, thin drainage channels that gather up the leftover fluid and carry it slowly back toward the chest to be returned to the blood. Those lymph channels have almost no pump of their own. They too depend on the squeezing of the muscles around them. So the very same contraction of the calf that drives the blood upward also milks the lymph along its channels. One motion, two drainage systems served at once. When the woman on the treadmill lost those few spoonfuls of water from her ankle, she was watching, without knowing it, the combined bookkeeping of capillary balance and lymphatic drainage, both of them switched on by the pump, both of them idle when she stood still. I find it beautiful, and I use that word carefully, that a single mechanical act settles so many separate accounts. But let me push on the water story a little further, because it tells you something about why the trouble, once it starts, is so stubborn. When fluid sits in the tissue day after day, year after year, it does not sit there innocently. It carries things with it, cells and proteins that leak out under the high pressure, and the body reacts to their presence the way it reacts to anything out of place. There is a slow, low simmer of inflammation. Over long stretches of time, that simmer changes the skin itself. The skin over a chronically swollen ankle grows stiffer, it darkens, it can turn hard and woody to the touch, and at the far end of that long road, in some people, the skin breaks down entirely and will not heal, because the tissue underneath is drowning in old fluid and starved of fresh flow at the same time. That is the venous ulcer, and it is why roughly 4 out of every 100 people past the age of 65 end up with an open sore on the lower leg that lingers for months. It is the same physics we started with, the 90 millimeter column, followed all the way to its unhappy conclusion. And the thing I want you to hold on to is that every step of that road is a pressure problem, and pressure, as we have seen, is the one thing walking reliably takes away. So consider the reversal from the other direction. If sitting still loads the column and lets the water seep out and lets the simmer begin, then motion unloads the column, draws the water back, and cools the simmer down. It is not a cure in the sense of erasing what the years have written into the vein walls. The stiffened collagen in the adventitia does not soften back to youth in an afternoon. The valve leaflets that have pulled apart do not knit their edges together again. But the pressure they generate, the day-to-day burden the leg actually feels, that can drop enormously and drop within seconds, and that is what changes how the leg lives. You can have imperfect valves and still spare the tissue the worst of the pressure simply by keeping the muscle working. The pump forgives a great deal that the plumbing has gotten wrong. There is a measurement that captures this forgiveness with real precision, and I like it because it turns something as vague as a heavy leg into a number you can put on a clock. Picture a person standing still after a bout of exercise, and picture the venous pressure in the foot creeping back up from its exercise low toward that resting value of about 90. In a leg with good valves, the climb is slow. The pressure has to refill the whole column from the top, drop by drop, through the ordinary trickle of arterial inflow, because the closed valves will not let any blood fall back down to help fill it faster. That refilling takes time, and in a healthy leg it takes more than 20 seconds, sometimes much more. But in a leg where the valves have failed, the blood comes flooding back down the wrong way the instant the muscle stops, and the pressure shoots up in a hurry, in well under 20 seconds. So the clock tells the tale. Time how long it takes the foot pressure to recover after exercise, and if it recovers too fast, you have caught a leaky valve in the act. A slow recovery is the signature of competence. A fast one is the fingerprint of reflux, and you did not need to see inside the leg at all. You only had to watch a pressure fall and time how long it took to climb back. I want to linger on how strange and lovely that is, that health here shows up as slowness. In so much of the body we prize speed, quick reflexes, a fast heart when we run, a rapid response to danger. But in the venous valves of the leg, virtue is patience. A good valve makes the recovery lazy. It insists that the only way to refill that pressure column is the honest, slow way from above, and it flatly refuses the cheating shortcut of letting blood tumble back down. The failing valve is the one in a hurry. When I first understood that, it rearranged something in my head, because it means that the number we care about, the thing that separates a young leg from an old one, is not how hard the pump pushes, but how well the little doors hold the line afterward. The pushing you can always supply as long as you are willing to move. The holding is the part that time steals and the part we are trying to defend. Now here is a thought I would like to leave turning slowly in your mind before we go on. We have spent this whole long evening treating the leg as a machine, and I make no apology for that, because it is a machine and a superb one. But there is a difference between the machines people build and the machine in your calf, and the difference is the whole point. A pump that an engineer builds runs whether or not the owner pays attention to it. You install it, you switch it on, and it labors away in the basement while you forget it exists. The pump in your leg is not like that. It has no motor of its own. It borrows its power entirely from your decision to move. It is a magnificent piece of hydraulic design. Thousands of little veins threaded through the soleus, delicate two-leaflet valves stationed all the way up the column. A reservoir in the calf that can hold many times the ordinary volume of blood, suction generated in the shin during the swing of every stride, and every last bit of it lies perfectly still and useless until you choose to take a step. The engineering is finished. It was finished before you were born, handed down through every upright ancestor who ever walked across open ground. The one component the design leaves out, on purpose, is the will to use it. And that, I think, is why the whole thing can look at first like a medicine, some clever new intervention, when it is nothing of the kind. There is no substance to swallow, no device to strap on, though the compression stocking helps and I do not dismiss it. There is only the reactivation of a pump that was always there, running the same physics it ran when you were 20, waiting the same way it waited then. The 90mm column is not your enemy. It is simply the price of standing upright on a planet with this much gravity, and it has been the price since the first fish crawled onto land and had to solve the problem of lifting its own fluids against the pull of the world. The calf pump is the solution that got handed down. It does not wear out from use. It wears out, if anything, from disuse, from the long hours of sitting that no ancestor of ours ever had the luxury or the misfortune to spend. So the question the whole evening keeps circling back toward is not really a medical question at all. It is closer to a mechanical confession. The pump is fine. The plumbing is doing its best. The only thing that has gone quiet, in most of the legs that ache at the end of a long day, is the motion that was meant to drive them.